Good morning. Good morning. Repeat after me. I am important. I am important. The reason why I start off with just that quick affirmation is often we as educators, the longer we're in our careers, sometimes we can be inundated with frustration. Sometimes we can see some of the outcomes that we're getting. And sometimes we can lose ourselves and forget the fact that we're so important to the community. So I think it's important for us to just affirm that consistently. Just to give you a little bit of background information about myself, my name's Algenoy Alexander. I'm a longtime educator. I initially started out teaching math about 2 decades ago. Do we have anyone who teaches math? Okay, it's just me in the room, just me. Okay. Then I transitioned to being a career coach where I was responsible for helping our young people in their careers. Do we have anyone who's responsible for that? Okay. Someone over in the back. We're all responsible for that if we're going to be honest, right? Then I transitioned to being the assistant director of an alternative school on the west side of Chicago. Do we have anyone who's familiar with the west side of Chicago? Okay, everyone's raising their hand. Good deal. Over the course of that 20-year career, I also want to say that I have 2 children. I have a 20-year-old daughter who's a chemical engineering major at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Right? Yeah, clap it up for that. And I have a 10-year-old son. So you all see there's a gap there, right? My parenting legs wasn't as strong, right? That being said, what I realized over the course of being an educator for 20 years and having children that have a wide gap, I realized that if I wanted to be effective in communicating with the wide variety of populations and being effective at what I did, I realized I needed to have more skills. Because raise your hand if you've heard or felt the energy of this generation is a little bit different. Oh yes, right? And in order to be able to connect with this generation, I went out and I studied a lot of different technologies and different modalities. One is called neuro-linguistic programming. Is anyone familiar with that, NLP? Neuro is the mind, linguistic is language. Programming is how we get specific steps. So it's dealing with the language of the mind in order to produce specific outcomes. I'm trained in timeline therapy, hypnotherapy, so on and so forth. So a lot of the conversation that I'm going to have today is going to be centered around dealing with how the mind processes information. Now, before we get started, I always like to start off with a gift. Because in any relationship, unless you want it to shift downward, you must start with the lift. Permission to exist. It's who we are. Like children trying to sift, looking for answers. Using all of your sense until it manifests as questions that might fall out of your lips like, why are we here? Well, I'm here for a conversation. No confrontations, but confronting the issues. Come on, let's face it. We've already done the research. We're in the field, and we're going to have this conversation as more than a trend. And hopefully today we're going to have a conversation that's actually restorative. And since you're here, giving me your time, I'm going to make one assumption. You're here to expand your mind, and I promise to make it productive, but we're going to have an agreement. We're going to have to assume positive intent because we're all here to learn. So I want you to bring your unique perspectives and your concerns. And I want to make sure that we're all stay connected. And if there's someone in this room who thinks that they already know it all, at least be polite. That's protocol. You're going to bring your unique perspectives and your gifts, and we're going to roll this ball as one team. No big I's, no little U's. And today we're going to have a conversation that's actually restorative. Is that cool? Is that cool? Good deal, good deal. The reason why I like to start off with a gift, and mine is creativity, poetry, because often when we become educators, we leave our unique gifts at home. And I truly believe that your unique gift is something that you have to be adamant about holding on to because it's your uniqueness that may be able to talk and impact the lives of a child, right? Why are we here? Why are we here? I think this is a very important question to ask, and I ask myself this question all the time. The reason why I think it's an important question to ask because it informs your next steps. Last night, I was laying in bed, and I knew that I had an all-day training today, and I said, I think I need to get some rest. Yet, I had my flat screen TV on. I had my phone sitting right next to me. What should have been my next steps if my intent was to get some rest? Put that phone on, do not disturb, turn that TV off, right? Because if my goal was to get rest, then I needed to remove some of the distractions. You have to ask yourself that question. Why am I here? If you're here to learn and if you're here to be engaged, then that should inform your next steps. Yes or yes? So that means that if we're going to be engaged, we should set our phones to the side, right? Right? Now, over the next 4 hours or so, we can have this one of two ways. Either I can talk at you for the next 4 hours, 5 hours, right? Talk at you, or we can have a conversation. Raise your hand if you'd prefer to have a conversation. Let me see. Good deal. So that's pretty much everyone. Because what I do know is there's a lot of wisdom in the room and a lot of content level experts. So I would love to have a conversation where we can be more restorative and actually impact our population. Can we do that together? Yes or yes? Yes. Good deal. Now, the way this is going to happen today, we're going to go over in 3 parts. The first part is going to be restorative mindset. The goal is to create a culture of empathy and advocacy, creating a culture of empathy and advocacy. We're going to start off with the restorative mindset because I truly believe that the mindset determines your actions and it determines what you do, right? If you don't have the right mindset and if you truly don't believe that restorative practices is important, then the likelihood of it being implemented with any level of fidelity is highly unlikely. Raise your hand if you know someone who works just hard enough not to get fired. They're not here, we know. They're not in this room, right? But we know they exist, which is why the mindset is critical. Then we're going to go into restorative language because you can be as positive as you want in your mind, but you can still use language that can escalate situations. You can still use language that can leave someone feeling harmed, right? So language is critical. Then we're going to go into restorative practices. Practices are those systems that support the mindset and the language. You can be as positive as you want. You can have the right mindset. You can have the right language. But if you don't have those systems in place to support that, then often things erode. What I found is in education, there's a lot of people that are leaving the field because they're frustrated. And I believe they're frustrated because they don't have those systems in place. All right? So let's get into it. Before we get into it, I want to always talk about the things that I'm going to be saying today. Think about it as systems that you can also share with your young people. This is called the FAME mindset. I truly believe that if you really want to be successful in life, it's critical that we have what's called the FAME mindset. The first thing is to think like a free agent. Let me get a volunteer. What's a free agent? Let me get a volunteer. This is when the conversation starts, right? Or I will volunteer someone. Let me get a volunteer. What's a free agent? Right here. What's a free agent?
I just related to sports. I hear my husband talk about it.
I'm with you. I got it. So you related to sports, right?
Right.
Do you know of any free agents that were popular?
No, but I know that I guess it's someone who's not really on a team or
Someone who's not currently under contract, right?
yeah.
So when a person think like a free agent, they understand that all of their opportunities are temporary, right? You may be an educator now, you may transition to administration. You may be dealing with a particular student, but that's going to be for a very finite amount of time. So a free agent understands they have to take advantage of every opportunity while it exists. What are the skills that I need to learn now that's going to prepare me for my next steps? What are the skills that I need to learn now that's going to allow me to better connect with my students? We're going to be here for a short period of time. Think about what are the things that you want to learn in this training because it's not going to be going on forever. Next is train like an athlete. Do we have any athletes, former athletes in the building? Okay, right? When you train like an athlete, athletes understand that if they want to become really good at something, they're going to have to put in the work, right? Some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about today are almost going to feel counterintuitive. They may feel like you're going to have to slow down your mind in order to actually implement them. But athletes understand that they want to develop what's called muscle memory. Raise your hand if you know what muscle memory is, right? Muscle memory is when you do something so consistent, when it gets to the time when you actually need it, it shows up for you, right? Raise your hand if you've ever seen an angry parent show up to a school, right? You don't want to prepare to have that conversation, that restorative conversation with that angry parent once they show up. It's critical that you learn that in advance and you practice it so that when you need it, it's actually there for you. And you're going to have to train like an athlete in order to have that. Prepare like a marketer. Marketers are those who create those messages that gets us to buy things, right? If I say ta-da-ta-ta-ta, right? Now, obviously, you all didn't memorize that on purpose, but McDonald's is a multi-billion-dollar corporation because they were deliberate and intentional about who their core audience is. It's important as we perform our tasks, we keep our audience in mind so that we can truly empathize and then advocate. Next, last but definitely not least, is work like an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs take full responsibility for the success and or failure of anything that they get involved in, right? You may have an administrator that you may not get along with. There may be another teacher who may not be putting forth their best effort. But I guarantee you, if you take full ownership of the knowledge and the energy that you can bring to a student, you can have a significant impact. But it requires that you work like an entrepreneur so that you can take full responsibility for the success and or failure of what you do. So now let's get into the conversation piece. I love this quote. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. This can be broken men, broken women, broken people. I want you to discuss really briefly for about a minute, discuss it with your neighbor. What does this mean to you? It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, broken women, broken people. Discuss it with your neighbor. You got about 60 seconds. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. So let me get some feedback. I heard a lot of good conversations going on. Let me get a volunteer. When you see this quote, what does it mean? Right here, let's talk about it. Talk to me.
We discussed in our group that it meant it was related to breaking a child's spirit, so that like if you break their spirit when they're young, when they get older, they think back and think about they have to like repair all these things about themselves. Like if we teach them young, they can make better choices now. So when they're older, they're not going back trying to learn what they should have learned in childhood. And then also, she was saying that it reminds her of the quote that hurt people hurt people.
Relates to breaking a child's spirit. Raise your hand if you've seen children that seem like they have their spirit broken, right? And they end up turning into broken people. And also hurt people hurt people. I love that. We get another volunteer from this side. Someone from this side. Give me some feedback. What in the back?
We just discussed that when they're younger, you can teach them good habits, mindfulness, how to repair strategies.
Yes.
Versus when you're older, you've already learned bad habits. It's harder to break a habit the more used to you're doing something than it is to learn the correct way.
Raise your hand if you found that to be true. It's easier to teach someone when they're younger, right? And it becomes a little bit more difficult. I do want to be mindful that it says easier to build, not impossible to build. Because sometimes we have the mindset that the older they are, and we take our feet off the pedal and we give up because we think it's too late. It'd be a little bit more difficult. I was thinking about this, and I was doing a training at one point, and my son was in the room. My son was 9 at the time, and he raised his hand. He said, "Dad, can I answer the question?" I said, "Sure." He said, "This reminds me of my ball of clay." He said, "When I take out a fresh ball of clay, it's easy to move." But he said the longer I leave it out, it starts to stiffen and stiffen and stiffen. And eventually, if I want to move it, I'll almost break it. I thought that was pretty conscientious for a 9-year-old. So I always brag on my son. That being said, this is one of my favorite quotes is because if you show me a person that's broken, I can show you the system that produced that broken person. Not the one third grade teacher that they had that was ineffective. Not the one principal, right? Not the singular parent. There's typically a system that's operating together that produces broken individuals, right? I also like to look at this as a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for us. Earlier, I talked about how many of us are leaving the profession. When we first get in the profession of education, we start off excited, believing that we're going to make a change. And based upon how you interact with your colleagues, and based upon the support of your administration, sometimes you end up that broken person who leaves the profession. So it's really important for everyone in here to realize how important you are to your other colleagues And you help determine if they will stay in the field or if they'll eventually get out of it. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? Now, let's talk about systems, because currently we're all in the system, right? We're all part of the system. Let's look at some of our results. The suspension and expulsion data. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Students with special needs represent 12% of students, but 58% placed in seclusion and exclusionary practices. Females of color are suspended at a rate of 12% compared to 2% for others. Black children represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but 48% of those who are suspended. Boys represent 54% of preschool enrollment, but 79% of children suspended once and 82% suspended multiple times. 95% of all school suspensions are for non-violent acts, right? Disrespect, things of that nature. So when you see this, I want to hear from you all. When you see this data, what do you think? Talk to me. When you see these numbers, what do you think? I think it's ridiculous. Talk about it. Why so? I like that, though. You got to call it what it is sometimes. Talk to me.
I just think even in my own school, they suspend for the wrong reasons, and they're not addressing the needs of the kids.
Absolutely, right? She said they're suspending students for the wrong reason and they're not adjusting to the needs of the kids. I respect that. Thank you. Right here.
For years, punitive does not work. It's not helping anybody. The students, the teachers, the administration, the communities. Why do we have like 10 deans for kids getting suspended? We have one social worker for the entire school. Why not switch it? And then maybe you'll see some real changes.
We snap into that, right? Do y'all feel that? You read that resonated with you? 100%. Anyone else? What do you see? Right here.
Why are suspensions happening in preschool?
Why are suspensions happening in preschool? And more importantly, what do we think is the impact of suspensions as early as preschool? What are they learning about who they are relative to education? Let's talk about why it's so important what we're doing here. There's a thing called the school to prison pipeline. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it, right? The school to prison pipeline refers to practices and policies that disproportionately place students of color in the criminal justice system. Black students are more likely than their white peers to be suspended or expelled for the same kinds of conduct. We have to be mindful. For the same kinds of conduct. Students who fail high school are more likely to be imprisoned. Students who do not graduate from high school go on to earn lower wages. And having a criminal record can make it more difficult to attain housing, financial aid, go to college. So can we see how the system that we're part of is producing broken men, broken women, broken people? Does that make sense? Yes or yes? This is something that we're currently a part of. When you disconnect someone from education, you disconnect them from the opportunities in life. And when you disconnect them from opportunities, you produce broken people. That initial quote was by Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was, at the time, obviously talking about the system of slavery. I truly believe that everyone in this room understands how terrible the system of slavery was. Yet, at the time, I imagine there were individuals who were part of that system who thought they were doing the right thing because that's how they grew up and that's what they learned. Well, we're similar. We all started our educational community, our educational process when we were 3 years old, probably in preschool, right? And we learned how to engage with adults. We learned how to engage with each other based upon that system. Raise your hand if you ever heard from an adult, children are to be seen, not heard, right? Some of these things, some of these concepts are the same concepts that produce the idea of suspensions and expulsions. So we're going to have to interrogate our own thinking. We're going to start interrogating our own thoughts because if we don't, we're going to be passively part of the problem as opposed to being actively part of the solution. and you really do have to choose sides. And today's conversation is going to be about interrogating our thoughts, regulating ourselves so that we're able to regulate our classrooms, regulate our school communities. You can't teach what you don't know. You can't teach what you don't practice. So the solution, restorative practices. Restorative practices is a system of formal and informal processes that create and sustain a culture of respect, responsibility, and justice through trusting relationships, building community, and repairing relationships when harm has occurred. We've all heard of restorative practices, restorative justice, but this demystifies it. When you see this definition, what are some things that jumps off the screen for you? What are some things that jump off the screen? Just go ahead and say it out loud. What are some things that you think are important as a part of this definition? The action word. Talk to me. What parts? Create. Create and sustain, right? We have to create and sustain, right? Through what? Formal and informal processes. That informal hug, that informal smile, right? And then the formal processes and systems that we have in place. What else do you think is important? Right here?
It's our responsibility.
Say it again?
It's our responsibility.
It's our responsibility, right? Raise your hand if you agree with that. It's our responsibility. And it's our responsibility to teach responsibility, right? Right here. Hands up.
Respect, responsibility, and justice. I feel like restorative justice or restorative practice, they think of only the, respect, and that we're not teaching students responsibility, and we're not teaching them justice.
Yes.
Those three words are very important.
Critical. It's a holistic approach. It's not just responding to things that have happened, it's creating that culture, right here?
I think culture is important because many times we can spend a lot of time trying to teach the kids what to do, but then the adults in the
Yes.
room aren't doing the same thing.
Yeah. You say often it's the adults that need to be taught, right? Because the students are going to do what we do, right here? Relationship. Talk to me. Why? Why is that important?
Building that rapport with the students, if you aren't connecting with them, if you don't know them, they're not going to trust you, they're not going to tell you things that are going on, you're not going to know.
Yes.
Maybe their house flooded and they've been living with their aunt for the last 2 weeks or whatever, so.
What you're saying is really important. One thing that jumps out for me is repairing relationships when harm has occurred. And when I look at that, there's a presupposition there. Repairing relationships. It presupposes that there was a relationship there to start with, right? And I think that's the thing that's critical. So it's the formal and informal things that we do in the building that builds that restorative culture, right? If we have that in place, the likelihood of the harm happening in the first place is drastically reduced, as opposed to waiting and responding. So let's talk about the differences between the traditional approach, what we have, versus what we should be doing. Under the traditional approach, the focus is on rules being violated. Student showed up late. Student used inappropriate language, right? That's probably Student Code of Conduct 3.67 or something, right? Under the restorative approach, people and the relationships are violated. What is the impact of the action as opposed to the specific rule? We're focusing on the impact. What relationship was damaged as a result of the student using inappropriate language, as a result of running in the hall, right? Let's talk about that. So under the traditional approach, justice focuses on establishing guilt. Did they do it? Did they not? So that we can come with that consequence. Under the restorative approach, justice identifies needs and obligations. What are the needs? What are the obligations that caused this to happen in the first place? It's not just about establishing whether they actually did it or not. Under the traditional approach, accountability is defined as punishment. Raise your hand if you ever seen somebody say, you gotta suspend that kid. You gotta hold them accountable. You have to suspend them. You heard that before? Right? We see it all the time. Under the restorative approach, accountability is defined as understanding the effects of the offense and repairing any harm. If they haven't done that, then you have not held them accountable. And that's central to restorative practices. Under the traditional approach, justice is directed at the offender. The victim is often ignored. Under the restorative approach, you have to include the entire community because the entire community is impacted. Under the restorative approach, under the traditional approach, rules and intent outweigh outcomes. It's about the rule. I remember there was a young man, he got into a fight his last week of school. And everyone was saying, you know what, you got to hold him accountable. You got to suspend him. And it's time for him to be suspended for the week, right? Because he got into a fight. Because it was the last week, I had to think about this and say, what will be the outcome or the impact of him being suspended the last week of school? Fail his class, summer break early, fail his classes, and what is the long-term ramifications of him failing his classes, right? So we have to think about things from a long-term perspective. Hold the victim, hold the person responsible for the behavior, and include them as part of repairing any harm that they've caused. That's restorative practices. We're not locked into an outcome of just simply suspensions. There's often no opportunity made to make remorse. That's central to restorative practices. So just by a show of hands, who prefers the restorative approach? Now, I've done this presentation hundreds of times, and everyone raises their hand when I ask that question. Yet, when it's time to implement it on a school level, there's often pushback, right? So let's deal with the elephants in the room. What are some of the myths? We're going to get to it. What are some of the myths associated with it? One, restorative discipline is soft. There are no consequences. Students get away with problematic behaviors. You all kind of thought that before, right? The fact is, with restorative practices, high expectations and accountability are central. If there's no accountability in it, where we're understanding the needs and the obligations, then that's not restorative practices. That's a Band-Aid that's being slapped on something, right? Myth number 2, the point of restorative discipline is to get rid of student removals, putting the full burden of student discipline on the classroom teacher. If I were the classroom teacher and I thought that was true, I wouldn't want restorative practices implemented if I think that my ability to have a student step out of the classroom and all the responsibility was going to be on me. The fact is, restorative practices is teaching and learning, supporting students to make responsible decisions and be accountable for their actions. And those are things that have to be taught so that the students can actually meet that expectation. Myth number 3, restorative practices takes too much time. Between the conversations, the circles, right? Have we thought that before? Or know some people who may have thought that? The reality is, the traditional approach is what takes too much time, because if you suspend a person and you haven't identified the needs and the obligations, if you haven't connected that student back to resources, what do you think is going to happen? They're going to do it again and again and again and again, right? Which really takes up too much time, which is why restorative practices is important to connect the student back to the underlying reason for why they do what they do. Last but definitely not least, restorative discipline is a job for the deans who are trained to deal with disciplinary issues in a restorative way. The reality is we're a community. And if we want to have a restorative community, it requires everyone in the community to be restorative in mindset and language and be part of the process. Right? So there's 2 pathways to get to restorative practices. First, empathy. Empathy has to be implemented. Empathy has to be understood. Empathy is the ability to sense other people's emotions coupled with the ability to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. The ability to identify the underlying driving forces behind actions. Talk to me, you all. Why do you think it's important to be empathetic? Why is that one of the pillars of restorative practices? Talk to me. Right?
Well, it makes you relatable to the other person. Like,
For sure.
You can put yourself in their shoes and even share an experience about yourself at that age and what you did, that
Yes.
I did the same thing. Like, I think that helps them, like, connect with you more.
It helps them connect with you more. It helps to build that trust as well, right? In the back? You're recognizing their feelings. I see you, I understand how you feel. If we're not being empathetic, then what we're really doing is taking a cookie cutter approach and applying it to everyone. Raise your hand if you ever experienced that before, someone applying a system that didn't necessarily match up with your individuality. Raise your hand if you've ever experienced that, right? Empathy is critical, but once we're able to empathize, once we're able to understand the underlying reasons, now we have to do something about it. That's where advocacy comes in. Advocacy is how we respond to breakdowns in ways that address the underlying causes so that we not only make right what went wrong, but reduce the likelihood of it happening again, right? Once we empathize, now we have to have advocacy. And we advocate through our language and we advocate through our systems. I love this quote. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. The most powerful way that people give up their power is by thinking that they don't have any. I love this quote. What do you all think about it? When you see that, what comes to mind for you? Say again? Voting. Talk to me. Why voting?
Just because it's such a, typically a large thing. And people are my one, this is who people are going to choose.
Yes.
My one is not going to make a difference.
My one individual perspective doesn't count. Why does it matter? So many.
And then when everybody thinks that, it leads to a larger, problem because people don't show up to vote and, and things like that.
Thank you. I appreciate that for sure. Is there someone else? Hands up. Right here.
So looking at who the quote is from, I am thinking of Celie from The Color Purple, who did not believe that she had power. And so many of the things that she went through in life was because she thought it had to be that way. But until she learned differently, that she took her power back.
I love that. When people don't know that they have power, it informs their activity, right? They try a little bit less because they don't believe that their actions are going to have an impact anyway. Right here?
When a person has been taught or trained through dictatorship or told what to do all the time and not given a choice of yes and no, I often say no is just as important of an answer as a yes. And so when people are told what to do all the time and not given a choice to choose for themselves, it's like I give up. You're going to tell me what to do anyway.
Absolutely. One thing that I've learned is I grew up with this concept. I was told a lot of times, if you believe it, you can achieve it. You've heard that? But sometimes we think it's just a cliche in terms of how much our beliefs can impact our reality. I want to do a quick exercise. I want you all to look around the room, and I want you to identify everything in the room that is blue. I want to see how good you are. Blue. Think to yourself, everything that's blue. I'm going to help you out. There's some blue right there. Blue right there. And the mug's blue. We see it? Look around. I want to see how good you are. Are we good? We think we're solid? Now what I wanted you all to do is to close your eyes. Let's test it. Close your eyes. Eyes are closed. Now I want you all to think about everything in the room that's green. You guys can open your eyes. I saw some disgruntled looking faces. Open your eyes. Open your eyes. Talk to me. How did that feel? Not great. Why? Because you didn't have access, right? But look around the room. Look at all the things that's green in the room. Did anybody look at their own shirt? Right? Their own bag, their own coat, right? The bag here. There's so much green in the room. Yet, because I told you what to focus on, it determined your experience, right? This is how the mind works. There's 2 million bits of information per second. 2 million, but your brain can only process 134 plus or minus 7. Out of 2 million per second, 134. What does that tell you? We miss a lot of information, right? So do you think that's a conscious process or an unconscious process? Talk to me. Unconscious process, because we don't have time for every second out of 2 million to, I'm going to take this 134 every second. We don't have the time, right? Yet, the 134 that we choose determines our experience. Have you ever seen anyone that seemingly complains all the time? No matter where they are, they can find something to complain about? It's because in their minds, they've been trained to see the negative. A person can walk into a community and see some trash on the ground, see some kids playing and say, this is the ghetto. There's nothing good here. And another person can walk into that same community and say, money-making opportunity, money-making opportunity, money-making opportunity, right? Your filters determine your experience, right? And we're going to really get into that even deeper throughout today. So how does this show up? The communication continuum. When you first interact with someone, you're not sure that they even exist until they come into your consciousness, right? Through smell, sight, all of your various perceptions, right? And then you become aware. And then once you become aware, it determines your level of engagement, right? Whatever your preconceived ideas are as you see them. So for me, I'm really in the shoes, right? So I'm often looking at people's sneakers. I'm seeing if there's any fellow sneakerheads in the room that I can connect with, right? I'm a pescatarian. So sometimes I'm looking at people's plates to see what they're eating because I have preconceived ideas around that. I see you have the unk on your earring, so I connect to that, right? I'm constantly looking for things that I connect to, and so are we, right? Unfortunately, there are times when we may see behaviors that we don't connect to, or we already have preconceived ideas about. For example, let's say school starts at 8:30. You have a student that comes in every day at 9 o'clock with a bag of McDonald's, sits in the back of the class, sneaking in McDonald's. What are some of the thoughts that we can have about that student? Let's keep it real. Right here. If they didn't stop at McDonald's, they could be on time. What else? Right here. At least they ate breakfast. Okay, positive. Right here. The rules don't apply to me. All of these preconceived, their parents don't care, right? So when you have these preconceived ideas, do you think that can inform the knowledge that you have about that student? It can inform that. Let's do this quick exercise. I want you on your first worksheet, it says, circle the positive traits that you feel best describes you. Take about 30 seconds to circle the ones that and don't just do one big circle. Mm-hmm. Right? Not one big circle, but just circle the individual things that you think best describes you. Take about 30 seconds. All right, let's get a volunteer real quick here. Let me get a volunteer. Right here. Let's go back here. Let's walk back and see how good you feel about yourself. All right? So, okay, let's see. So you consider yourself to be optimistic, persistent, okay, patient, decisive, flexible, and practical. These are all good traits. Yes or yes? That being said, and I want everyone to look at the things that they circle. Look at it. Look at how good you feel about yourselves. Raise your hand if it feels good when people affirm the positive traits that you see in yourself. Raise your hand if it feels good. What I want you to do is now flip it to the other page, the other side, and hold it up to the light. And those are the negative ways that people can perceive your very positive traits, right? Let's get over here, right? Let's see. So instead of being optimistic, people see her as being unrealistic. She thinks she's a visionary. They just say you're unrealistic. Decisive, no, you're insensitive. Practical, no, you're mundane. I'm a risk taker. No, you're just impulsive, right? Thank you. The reason why this is critical is when we talked about the filters earlier. We talked about those filters. Everyone has a thing that's called implicit bias. And we have to overcome our implicit bias, things that we believe to be true, right? Sometimes we can engage with someone. Imagine someone's thinking that they're positive. They're thinking that they're bringing their best selves to the table, and you're treating them like the opposite based upon your preconceived ideas. But let's imagine this. Imagine you thinking the negative things about yourself. What would be the impact of you focusing on the negative when you could perceive yourself as the positive? It goes both ways, right? And I think it's really important that we start to identify some things that we can do. Now, in terms of implicit bias, you all might not have noticed, maybe not, I am a black man. Yeah, right. Shocking, right? And I'm a black man, and I live in Chicago. And I live right up the street from a high school. And there are times when students are getting out of school, and they're walking up, it may be 5 or 6 young men, and the new style that, wear hoodies even in the summer, mask even in the summer, right? And as black as I am, sometimes I get a little uncomfortable when I see 5 or 6 young black men walking in my direction. And I'm black, right? So I have to first pay attention to how I feel. The next thing you want to do is acknowledge your assumptions. What are the assumptions? And these are also, they should be on your handouts as well, just to let you know. What are the assumptions? My assumptions is, well, I feel like I dress relatively decent. Maybe they want something from me, right? What am I saying? Maybe they're on something today, right? So then I have to ask myself, where does my perspective come from? Where does it come from? Now, I can tell you, as a youth, I got into more fights than most. That being said, if I thought about the percentage of young black men that ever actually caused me any harm, it would be 0.0001%. Almost, it would be negligible. And I've actually had real life experience fighting, right? Yet my fear is not based on my lived experience. So if it's not based on my lived experience, then where does it come from? Right? Media. Where else? Media that's in our house, right? The family dynamics, right? Sometimes we have these ideas, we have to figure out where they really come from. And then once we do that, we have to seek other perspectives. What are some of the other perspectives that we could have? Well, I remember when I was younger, and even though my waistline was probably a 31, I wore a size 36. And I had the 3X t-shirt and the big hat and the long chain. And my mother said I looked like a thug, but I wasn't, right? So so maybe this is a similar spin on that now. I'm looking at the youth now concerned, and really it's just fashion, right? So what are some of my examine some of my options. I could cross the street, could do that. Or I could engage them before they get there. How y'all doing today? Everything's good? Engage, test the temperature there, right? There's no singular answer to what you should do, right? It's your responsibility to keep yourself safe. But I truly believe if you go through this process, it can help you, right? It can help you make better decisions and conclusions. Often we stop at knowledge when we need to start clarifying. Imagine if that was the culture of our buildings, where we clarified information so that we truly got to understanding, as opposed to making a decision strictly based on our preconceived ideas and notions. Understanding is a great place to get to. But what we really want to get to is empathy. And the way that we get to empathy is by identifying and relating to the underlying reasons why they did what they did. Now, just a quick test. Raise your hand if you've ever cursed out a teacher. Okay. There's a few of us in here, a few, right? Now, raise your hand if you've ever been frustrated with the teacher and you didn't know what to say. You were frustrated with the teacher, right? That's almost everyone, right? So if you can connect to that being the reason, now I can say, I understand how you feel. Even if I disagree with the behavior, I can tap into the underlying reason. Does that make sense? When we talk about implicit bias, my brother has cerebral palsy, right? And my big brother was everything to me. He is everything to me. He was into fashion. He had me rapping and freestyling at the age of 7. He gave me my first advice about young ladies. He did everything for me. Yet there were times when I would go out with him in the street and I would go somewhere with him, and people will walk up to him and they start talking loud and treating him like an infant, as if he had limited capacity. And I'm like, they don't even know him. Do they know all the things? He fights me, right? Implicit bias. Sometimes, even though we're the educators and we're the professionals, sometimes we bring our limitations to students that they may not necessarily have. And we have to start challenging that and questioning that. And by seeking other perspectives, you may not have had success teaching someone who seemingly doesn't have the capacity, but maybe it's time to talk to someone else. Hey, do you know someone who's had success in this situation? So that now you can implement that. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? Good. So, 4 classes of decision making. We're often taught to make good decisions, do the right thing, but we're not taught what the right thing is, right? This is a system that you can work through with your students, with yourselves, because we still live these things as well. So the first class of decision is a class 1. A class 1 decision is something that feels good, it's good for you, it's good for others, and it's good for the greater good. It's good for you, it's good for others, and it's good for the greater good, right? So somebody throw some things out there. You can just say them. What are some things that will fall into a class 1? Some decisions, some things that you do. Help somebody. Let's get specific. Some things that you do that's a class 1. Right here. Volunteer. Volunteering will be a class 1. It feels good. It's good for others. It's good for you. It's good for the greater good. What else? What else? Talk. When you get enough sleep. I like that one. Now we have to test it though, because sometimes you can be sleeping and you can get enough sleep, right? But sometimes that sleep can be too much and it can be a sign of depression, right? So we have to always test it against class 1, right? I'm currently working out. I'm looking to get back in shape and get back into the space that I want to see myself as. So does working out feel good to me? No. Hell no. No, just kidding. No, right? But I know it's good for me. It's good for others, and it's good for the greater good. Eating certain types of vegetables, right? It may not taste good, so that means it will fall into what's called a class 2. A class 2 is something that doesn't feel good, but it's good for you, it's good for others, and it's good for the greater good. Talk to me. What are some things that fall into that category? Class 2. Something that doesn't feel good, but you know it's good for you, it's good for others, and it's good for the greater good. Going to therapy. It may not always feel good, but you know it's the right thing. I love that one. Give me another one. What about showing up to work? Sometimes. So sometimes. Not every day. But sometimes. But we know it's good for us. What else? Following the rules of the road. Knowing, you're not supposed to be going fast, but, right? I get it. So ultimately, a class 1 and a class 2 experience are the things that we want to do. That's the most optimal, right? Even if it doesn't feel good, but we know it's good for us, it's something that we should do, right? And everything is not always going to feel good. Some of the things that we ask our students to do, we may ask them to study, we may ask them to practice, we may ask them to have a difficult conversation with the student, right? Sometimes it's difficult to have a difficult conversation with your colleague about one of their practices. But we have to learn how to do the difficult things if it's good for us, good for others, and good for the greater good. That being said, this is a very imperfect world, and in an imperfect world, trauma exists. And often because of trauma, because of our life experiences, the things that we've learned, we often may do class 3 and class 4 experiences. Class 3, something that feels good, but it's not good for us, not good for others, and it's not good for the greater good. What does that look like? What are some things? Huh? Oreos. You said that's class 1, huh? All that saturated, all the saturated fats. What about all the unhealthiness in it? What about all the oils and such? Butter pecan ice cream. I ate something, I love it. But I know it's not good for me. But it tastes so good. It feels good, right? But it's not good for me, right? What about I know this doesn't happen in education. What about gossiping? Not in here. No one gossips in here, obviously. Those are your other colleagues, right? Gossiping. What about bullying? Right? Things may feel good, but it's not good for you, not good for others, not good for the greater good. Class 3 activities are things that tend to not need much motivation because they feel good. Class 2 do require, because it doesn't feel good, it requires some external motivation to get you to do it. Class 3, you need motivation to not do it because it's not good for you, not good for others, not good for the greater good, right? What about a class 4? Class 4 are things that we do that don't feel good, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for others, and it's not good for the greater good. What are some things that fall into that category? Fights, right? Fights. It could be a class 3 for somebody, but for a lot of us, it's a class 4, right? It doesn't feel good. Yet, do we know people who fight? We do. What else? What else falls into a class 4? I'll tell you, I'll be transparent. I remember the first time I drank alcohol. I'm not going to expose my age, but the drink was Mad Dog 2020. Right? Do you think it felt good? It did not feel good. Do you think I drank again? I went to college. Yeah, I drank again. Fraternity. Yeah, I drank again. Even though it didn't feel good, it wasn't good for me, wasn't good for others, wasn't good for the greater good, right? So when we think about our actions, we often do things that fall into all 3 of these classes. Your students will do things that fall into all 3 of these classes. I think it's important to know what is the underlying driving force for why these things are done in the first place, all right? Let's talk about it. The human needs, right? If you show me a person that's doing something inappropriate, I can show you a need that they are trying to meet, right? And in the absence of those in the absence of us proactively meeting their needs, then they may do inappropriate things in order to meet the need, right? But the underlying need is an important need and it's positive, right? But what they do to meet the need may be negative. So let's talk about it. The 6 human needs. 1, the need for certainty, predictability. We might call that being safe. The need for variety, unpredictability. The need for significance or to be recognized. The need for love, the need to feel connected. The need to grow, the need to feel like we're growing. And then last but definitely not least, the need to contribute. What makes us different, because we all have these needs, but what makes us different individually is how we rank these needs. So at the end of this, I want you all to rank what you think your rank is. Do you think you need more significance? That's more important to you? Is safety more important? So let's talk about it. So the first is the need for certainty, the need for predictability, the need to know I'm moving towards pleasure and away from pain, the need to feel safe. We have to think about some of the things that we do in order to feel safe. What are some of the things that you all do, really quick, in order to increase your feeling of safety? What are some of the things you do? What's that again? Conceal and carry. Okay, that's true, right? Some people want the certainty of conceal and carry. Ultimately, and I'm not going to judge that here or there, but when you live in a society that feels that the only way to protect itself is through weaponry, is that good for the greater good? It's probably not, right? If we're thinking about it from that perspective. So there's positive ways in order to ensure your future. If I'm a supervisor, I could mentor someone in a positive. That's a class 1 or a class 2. Or I could micromanage, be overly controlling, which will be a class 3 or a class 4. Do you know any people that are overly controlling? Right? Micromanage. The need that they're trying to meet is the need for certainty. They just need a more positive way to meet that need. Studying, healthy relationships, proper diet, jobs that you enjoy. All of these are ways to increase our certainty to know that we're moving towards pleasure and away from pain. Do you know anybody who stays in a toxic relationship and you have no idea why? Right? It's because what they know, the need for certainty, supersedes their need to leave and find something else. The devil that they know is better than the one that they don't. And until they realize that and have the idea that they can achieve happiness outside of the toxic relationship, they can meet that need, more than likely they're going to stay in it. Unfulfilling job, similar thing, right? So it's important to know that we have to implement things in our school to meet that need. That certainty, that hug that they're going to get when they walk in, that smile, the consistency of the classroom, making sure that they feel safe, that they feel heard. If that need is not proactively met, then it may lead to them trying to meet it in their own ways, and it could be detrimental. Now, if something is too consistent, what do we think happens then? Too predictable, boring, right? And that because it violates the next need, which is the need for variety, unpredictability, the need for change, the need for novelties, the need for inconsistency, right? If we watch this, I have some of my favorite movies. I watched them so much, then it became one of my non-favorite movies because I watched it too much, right? Because we need that variety. When you have a student that's getting up and going to the bathroom 5 or 6 times in one class period because they're looking to change the environment, they're bored. They just need more effective ways in order to meet that need. Some may do for positive ways. They may do extreme sports, new hobbies, gaining new skills, right? Negative ways to meet this need, substance abuse, drugs, right? There are things that we do in order to switch up and change our states that's a class 3 or a class 4. And it could be the direct result of trauma that we had in our lives. So it's important to note. Variety is the spice of life, but we have to make sure we're meeting it in appropriate ways, right? The next is the need for significance, the need to feel important. Sometimes we say, look at little Johnny. Johnny always wants attention. No, he doesn't want attention. He needs attention because attention is an actual human need. The need to feel important, the need to feel unique, the need to feel valued. And if a student doesn't feel valued, then they're going to find ways in order to get that recognition. Even as adults, if we're not feeling recognized on our jobs, if we're not feeling recognized in our home, then we may seek other alternative ways to get that need met. And in some ways, it may be a class 3 or a class 4. What are some of the negative things that you may see? Belittling others, violence, right? Violence is a quick way of showing you're going to see me. If I knock this off the table, it may be the wrong thing to do, but now I have your attention. And even though it's something negative, I'm still getting the recognition that I need. So you may have students that do inappropriate things, right? They may knock something off the table because they want to feel recognized. So we have to have systems in place to proactively meet the need so that they can feel special in the midst of their class. Unfortunately, we often pick the same students to give recognition to, the ones that are performing excellent, right? Or the ones that are on the extreme other end, right? But what about those students who are in the middle? We're going to move them across that continuum. The next need, the need for love and connection, the need for relationships, affection, and belonging. Positive ways we can, through meaningful relationships, through joining organizations, group activity, those will be class 1 and class 2. But there are negative ways to meet these same needs. You may see students doing inappropriate things with other students in the building, right? Why? Because of that. They want that connection. We may see students bullying. Why? Because I'm going to bully this person so that I'm not getting ostracized now. And if we don't teach our young people an appropriate way to get that love and that connection, if we don't build their capacity to reach these needs in positive ways, then we're leaving them to do it on their own. If we don't proactively meet these needs so that it's already being met, then we're leaving them to meet it on their own, and they may choose inappropriate ways. The need for growth, the need to feel like I'm constantly growing. They say if you're not growing, you're dying, right? Positive things that we can do, education, If you have a student in the classroom and they don't feel like they can learn, what do you think they're going to do? Talk to me. You have a student in class and they don't feel like they can learn. They're going to act out or they're going to disengage, right? Because it's violating the need to feel like I can learn, I can grow, and that need is not being met, right? Some of the negative ways that people may meet this need is by sabotaging others. I want to get promoted to a position, so I'm going to talk negative about someone else. I want to end up winning, so I'm going to trip someone, right? Because we want to feel like we're constantly growing and winning, but we have to teach the most appropriate ways to do it. Last but definitely not least, and this is one that's often ignored, the need to contribute. I've done a lot of coaching. I coach individuals in relationships, and one of the primary reasons why those relationships don't work is I've heard people say, you know what? I know why I value my partner. I can name it, I can list it. I have no idea why they value me. I have no idea what they get from me, right? And if you're not able to show that you're contributing, that's how we assess our value to the world. So we have to figure out, how can we help our students feel valuable? How can we help them to contribute? How can we give them voice and choice within our systems? Because if we don't proactively do it, then they're going to find their own ways to do it. And those ways may be negative. Does that make sense? Do we have any questions about these 6 human needs? What I would like for you to do, we're about that time, 2:45. What I would like for you to do really quick here, I want you to rank them, just right next to them. Rank them in terms of importance. How do you prioritize them? Some of you may say, you know what, recognition is the most important thing to me. I need to feel like I'm the man or the woman or the person, right? Some people say, you know what, certainty and predictability is important. Some of you may say, you know what, love, the need to connect is most important. Go ahead and quickly rank them in order. This is what makes everyone different, how we prioritize meeting these needs and how we meet the needs. All right, let's come back. Let me get one volunteer to walk me through how they prioritize meeting of the needs. Let me get one volunteer. You see? Right here.
You want me to just?
Yeah, talk about first, second, third, fourth.
First, I would say significance and recognition.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, love and connection. Number 3, certainty and predictability. Number 4, growth. Number 5, contribute.
Mm-hmm.
And then number 6, variety and unpredictability.
I love that. Now, when you're working with, sometimes you can, as you're engaging with your students, you can make observations and you can kind of see how they prioritize it. You think it's shocking that she said recognition was number 1? She raises her hand, she volunteers, right? She's contributing a lot, right? No, that's great, right? So it's important. There are things you can look for to see, and then you can meet those needs because we're not all the same. And you want to make sure that you're differentiating and meeting those students where they are based upon what you think where they prioritize. What we'd like to do, and you can do this and then go right into your break, discuss with the individuals at your table of the 6 human needs, what do you think you're strong for yourself? What do you think you're strong for yourself? The staff that you have, where do you think you're strong for your students and the staff at your school? You may be really good at recognition. You might be really good at creating connections, right? Then of the 6 human needs, where do you think you're falling short for yourself? What are some things that you think you need to meet in more positive ways? Some of you may feel like, you know what, I haven't been getting enough recognition on my job, or I'm not getting the recognition I need at home, right? Let's figure that out. In terms of your staff, in terms of at school, or your students, what systems are not in place? How are you not proactively meeting these needs, right? And then talk about what you can do to overcome some of these shortcomings. So we're going to lead that. You can start that discussion, and then you can go right into your break. Yes, yes.
Can you put the growth slide back up for me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. You have it? I have it. You have
got
it?
it?
I do. I have it. We're just, yeah. So feel, what you read to me, you need to feel personal development.
If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. I do respect your time. It is right now 10:45. You do have a 15-minute break. So we're going to be back here at 14-minute break. Let's be back here at 10:59. Can we do that? 10:59. So, before we move on to discuss language, I would love to hear from you all in terms of the human needs. I know there was some engaging conversations. I would love to hear what you came up with. What are some of the things that you think you're strong in for yourselves as well as for your school? Let me hear from you all. Oh, right here.
We were both saying that the love and connection piece is strong,
Okay.
with having a good connection with the students and staff, and
Okay.
that growth for both of us kind of is something that maybe needs to be worked on, kind of changing with the times and,
Yeah.
Meeting the kids where they're at. And
Okay. So you're saying in terms of you're pretty strong in terms of making those connections and giving them the opportunity to be connected. If I may ask, if other people who think that they're strong in that in terms of a school, what are some of the practices that you put in place in order to proactively create the environment for that connection? What are some of the things that you do if you think that your school is strong at creating those connections? Right.
our classrooms do like SEL time each week. And,
Okay.
In our classrooms, for the deaf classrooms, often we do role playing.
Okay.
In certain situations to try to teach them, social cues and things like that.
Great. Important. That's very important. If we expect something of our students, then we need to do something to build their capacity. So we're going to talk about that even more in depth. What are some areas that we think we are having some challenges in? What are some things we can need some more ideas on what we can implement for our schools? Where do we feel like we're falling short? Don't everybody jump out at once, or else I'm going to stop pointing to people. Right? Growth. Okay.
Yeah, just because I service more of the inner cities outside of Chicago.
Sure.
And it's not a lot of growth that you see there.
Okay.
But it's not the district's fault. I think it's just maybe a collective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all just need to work together to get that growth.
One thing, and I appreciate that, the transparency on that. One thing that I often do is connect students back to areas that they have grown in, even if it's independent of the lesson that I'm teaching, right? If they've grown in sports, or if they've grown in, even in terms of their ability to communicate their ideas to me more, right? Reinforcing that they can learn and show them how they've learned in the past, And because once you do that, it gives them the ability to now believe I can learn in other areas. So sometimes it requires that we point out and find the things that they've grown in so that they can build the confidence to grow in other areas. In the back?
I think whatever the significance, right, recognition, the love, connection, and growth piece, I'm itinerant, so I travel to 16 different schools a week.
Okay.
And with that, though, sometimes we'll have students who have equipment, hearing equipment. And just last week, I had another student who was newly diagnosed. She got a new FM system, but there was a past student who really struggled with acceptance on it, and now she's like the model student. So I went to her, and I said, hey, your friend, because they had already talked about it.
Yes.
You know, got it today, blah, blah, blah. I said, can you do me a favor? Will you make sure you check up on her, because I'm not gonna be able to come back this week. So if she needs help with putting it in or whatever, and she was like, oh yeah, I'm on it. I got it, no problem. Went and checked in on her that same day.
Yes.
They talked about it after school, so it was a kiddo who was like really reserved and didn't put them in that leadership, mentorship role. Like I was like, you got this, you know what to do. You can troubleshoot everything. You can,
Yeah.
And I mean, it was, I'm getting goosebumps right now.
I love it. I feel it for you.
Like, it was just.
The good thing is you met multiple needs in there. The need for recognition, connection, as well as contributing. So now that student got the opportunity to see value in themselves through assisting someone else, right? And that's one of the things that we often ignore, how good we feel when we're able to help someone else. And sometimes we use that, we weaponize that by not giving students the ability to do that if we think they haven't earned it. And if we think they haven't earned it and we're not giving them that, right, then it's going to show up as an unmet need that may manifest into more negative behaviors. So we have to proactively allow all of our students to be able to contribute so they can feel valued and feel valuable. A good friend of mine back in the day, his name was Kanye West. We were friends. And I know. And he said a long time ago, if you can't be used, you're useless, right? And I know that's a harsh thing, but the reality is we have to help our students know that they can be utilized and that they're useful. Because if you don't feel useful, then that causes anger. And then that anger is going to say, you're going to see me. And then I might start knocking things off the table or manifesting and being upset or using inappropriate language. And we don't know why. It's because they may not feel useful. And we haven't cultivated that feeling. So I appreciate that. This is something that I think is important for you to deep dive, even when you go back to your schools. If we're not proactively meeting the 6 human needs and showing them class 1 and class 2 ways to meet those needs, then they may meet them on their own and they may choose class 4, class 3, and class 4 ways to meet them. So my recommendation would be to take this to your classrooms, put them up, talk about that system. Right in the back.
I like this, how you have it set up. It reminds me of like the love languages in a relationship where some people need the acts of service.
Yes.
And that. But it also shifts because not like when you compare the two, I might be a person that I need the acts of service.
Yes.
And when you grow, that may not be my love language anymore. It's
Right.
something different. So we can't assume that some of these needs, as far as students are concerned, that, okay, they really need this, this, and this, but they may have shifted or grown
Yes.
in a level where, okay, that's not my priority need right now, and that's not what we need to focus on. So we have to be flexible and knowing how to discern
Yes.
what's needed and when it's needed.
I really appreciate that because she's talking about the concept of people evolving and those needs shift. There may be a time where I may need more recognition. And then if a person always recognizes me, now I may need more connection, right? Because sometimes these things can seem to be contradictions to each other, right? I may want to be recognized. And sometimes you can get recognized so much to the point where now it causes you to be ostracized, right? Oh, that person thinks they're all that. Or they're constantly getting recognized by the teacher. We don't want that person anymore, right? So it's important to know how those feelings and how those needs literally can shift. There was an artist by the name of Kurt Cobain, rich, famous, committed suicide, right? You can get to the point where you're recognized so much, but you have no connection, right? So it's important to meet all these needs and be flexible in recognizing them. I love the quotes. Words so innocent and powerless as they are, as standing in a dictionary, how potent for good and evil they become in the hands of one who knows how to combine them. Talk to me. Take a moment to talk to your neighbor. Take about a minute. What is this quote? What does it conjure up? How does it relate to your practice? Talk to your neighbor. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. So let me hear from you all. Let me get some of those volunteers. When you see this quote, what does it mean to you and how does it relate to your practice? Right?
So we said a couple of things. One is how you say something, especially when you don't have sign language. You could be like, oh yeah, you did a good job. And when you're signing that and your expression, the way you say it, also your voice is different versus, oh, yeah, you did a really good job. Like, so your intonation and your expression can change. One's good, one is different.
I love it. I love it. This kind of leads into why is language important? Let's connect these two. Why is language important? Right here.
It can build you up or it can tear you down.
It can build you up or it can tear you down. That's something that I've often heard the phrase, say there's life and death in the power of the tongue. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase before, but that's literally a thing. And we talked about it in terms of NLP, in terms of the communication model, the 2 million bits of information per second, the 134 that you actually process. It often shows up through your language, right? Somebody else talk to me. Why is language important? Why is language important? Right here.
Language is how we form relationships with others. We communicate, we find out about people, we tell people about ourselves. We understand each other through language.
We understand each other. That's how we make our connections. An archaeologist says that about 75 million years ago, we started to develop complex language. We started to develop more complex language, right? And with that developing of more complex language, it allowed us to contribute more. It allowed us to evolve as a species, right? Initially, when language was limited, there were very small bands of groups of people who would get together, very small bands. And through that evolution of language, it allowed groups to come together and be a lot more productive. As opposed to me just describing a lion, now I can say, you know what, there's a lion over there by the lake and it's chasing a gazelle. Let's have a conversation around how we're going to stop the lion so that we can actually get to the gazelle and eat, right? And that requires more complex language and more complex thought, right? And the more over these millions of years, language has evolved, and it allows us to do a lot of things, right? We convey ideas, share thoughts, emotions, information with others. We build connections through language, right? Often just saying a simple word can allow us to connect with the student. We influence perceptions. The words that we choose to use can help a person see themselves as positive, or they can choose to see themselves as negative. Strictly through the language and the words that we're using, we can resolve conflict, speak to the nuances that's causing an argument. Language is so extremely powerful because it's been evolving and changing over the course of a lot of years, right? So we all have a lot of language. We're the educators, right? We've graduated from college and we've read the books, right? And we have so many words. Yet, raise your hand if you've ever been having a conversation with someone and saying, what are you talking about? Like, what are you talking about, right? So even though we have all of these languages, all of these words, there are still times where we're having a conversation and a person is misunderstanding what you're saying. You may be misunderstanding them, right? Often, the reason why is because, especially when we're in states of trauma, we often communicate, but we're omitting very important information. We're omitting very important information. We're often distorting, generalizing, or deleting information. You ever heard a person say, I hate this school, but there's some information that's missing? This school is whack. Well, maybe I say whack. This school sucks, whatever you all would say. I don't know, it's a new generation, right? But they're saying something, but there's so much information that's missing that you have to process. Distortions. Distortions is the cognitive tendency to misinterpret or exaggerate information, leading to a skewed perception of reality. In communication, distortions involve altering facts, emphasizing certain details, or introducing personal biases that may deviate from an accurate representation. I like to call it this equals that, right? This equals that. She didn't speak to me today. So what does that mean, right? So now person, she didn't speak to me, she doesn't like me. That's a distortion, right? A generalization, making broad, sweeping statements or drawing conclusions based on limited evidence. In communication, generalizations oversimplify complex situations, attributing universal characteristics to a group or assuming that a single experience applies to everyone in a particular context. These teachers never listen, right? Students may say things like that. This school doesn't ever help. That's a generalization based upon the interpretation of a singular event that now they're applying. And if I felt like teachers never help, do you think that would elevate my anger? Versus if I just specified the specific person, right? And sometimes we're going to have to help them do that. Deletions. Deletions occur when specific information is omitted or ignored during communication. It involves leaving out crucial details, facts, or aspect of a situation, which can result in incomplete or misleading understandings of the message, right? So it's important that we have a system to correct distortions, challenge generalizations, and recover deletions. I call this the meta model. It's a series of questions that can help to correct distortions, challenge generalizations, and recover deletions. I use it all the time because it helps to make clarity, to bring clarity in situations that need clarifying. It often helps to figure out how I'm constructing my own problems and how someone else may be constructing theirs. If a student comes to me with an issue, the only thing I have to do is ask questions. And in asking the questions, we're helping each other reveal how they're constructing the problem without me automatically bringing a solution. Because as educators, that's something we often like to do. That teacher hates me. No, they don't. If they hated you, they wouldn't be here. Right? Does that sound familiar? If they didn't like you, they wouldn't come to you. They wouldn't have ever been a teacher. Right? But how does that make the student feel? Like you haven't heard them. That you're taking a cookie cutter approach. So what we're talking about today is using the meta model, a series of powerful questions, in order to ask them questions so that they can realize that they're generalizing, distorting, and deleting. I utilize this process with my staff all the time, with everyone, really. And I think that if we use this in the school, if we master it, where the teachers are using it, administration and students, now there's a lot of clear communication. So let's kind of walk through it. Distortions. These are examples of distortions. One, the mind read. The mind read is claiming to know someone else's internal state. Example, you don't like me. Right? That's claiming to know what someone else thinks about them. So there's questions we can ask in order to challenge that. A lost performative. The value judgments where the person doing the judging is left out. It's bad to be consistent. According to who? Right? Cause and effect. You make me sad. Right? Your actions are making me sad. Right? Putting the responsibility of your internal feelings on someone else is a distortion. Complex equivalence, where two experiences are interpreted as being synonymous. She's always yelling at me. She doesn't like me. So have you ever yelled at a person that you liked? Yes. So maybe it doesn't mean, right? asking questions in order to get them to realize what they're actually doing, right? I always just say this doesn't always have to equal that. Listen for the conclusions that people are drawing and then challenge how they're drawing those conclusions by asking questions. Where's those conclusions coming from? It may be accurate. The teacher, she doesn't like me. How do you know? She said it. Oh, and now we have some more questions we have to ask, right? Generalizations. These are examples of generalizations in language. Universal quantifier. Universal generalizations such as all, every, never, everyone, no one, as in she never listens to me. Typically, when I hear a generalization, that's typically an easy one for me to challenge. Because I'll just say, never? And then the person thinks, not never, today. Whew. All right, now let's talk about it. Does that make sense? If I felt like someone never listened, or if I generalized to that degree, it will increase my anger. And now I'm taking that anger everywhere. If you can get a person to realize that this is a singular moment, and now we can process that appropriately just by challenging the generalization. Modal operators of necessity, as in should, shouldn't, must not, have to, need to, it is necessary. As in, I have to take care of her. I had to fight. You ever heard that one? I had to fight. What would have happened if you didn't? Simple questions that we have to ask that we can gain the information to figure out what's the underlying thinking behind the action. What would happen if you didn't take care of her? Right? It's fact finding. Modal operators of possibility, as in can't, will not, won't, may not, possible, impossible. Example, I can't tell him the truth. What would happen if you did? That's where you get to figure out what's going on behind the scenes, just by asking that question, as opposed to saying, yes, you can. You can tell me, right? One time doesn't equal all the time. Sometimes we have to point out, even in ourselves, we're taking one incident and now we're applying it to everything. We have to be able to challenge that. Deletions, nominalizations, process words which have been frozen in time, making them nouns. There's no communication here. Unspecified verbs. He rejected me. Let me hear from you all. He rejected me. What's unspecified about the verb? I'm going to point to one. What is it? How, right? How? Because rejected, we don't even know what that means for that person. So then they say, well, they didn't call me back. So now I can go to the next thing. Have you ever not called someone back and it didn't mean that you didn't reject, or does it have to mean that? So now you're asking questions and they're realizing, oh, I don't have to be this upset, strictly by asking questions. Simple deletions, as in simple deletion, I am uncomfortable. Uncomfortable with what? Uncomfortable with whom? Why are you uncomfortable, right? They're omitting some information that needs to be asked. Lack of a referential index. Fails to specify a person or thing. They don't listen to me. What's missing there? They don't listen to me. Who is they? Right? Who is they? And there's another one in there too if we want to. There's something else, right? What else? How? How could be in there, right? What does it mean to be heard? Right? They never listened to me. So now you're figuring out what would have to happen in order for you to feel like they listen. So there's always information that's missing. And if you ask the appropriate questions, now you're able to gather how they're creating the problem in the first place. Comparative deletions, as in good, better, best, worse, more, less. She's a better person. According to whom? Right? How so? How long have you believed that? There's a lot of questions that we can ask once we figure out that they're deleting some information that we have to figure out. Whenever you're having conversations with students, or even with staff or with your mates, using the meta model is powerful It helps you gain awareness and perspective. You can figure out where they're coming from. You can facilitate different responses, thus giving them new choices. And the more you give them new choices, that becomes new behaviors. You can expand or modify the limitations of their mind. And often when individuals are operating from a trauma space, they're constricted because it's a trauma response and they're communicating from their traumas. So by asking them questions, it's starting to break up the construct that's causing them to operate in the first place. Uncover the core of a person's perceptions. You can identify how to best motivate them. The meta model is a powerful tool. I remember when I first started using it, they would call us meta monsters because we would constantly, around the school, constantly just kind of toying and playing with it. Someone would make a generalization, and we say never, always, right? And we would just constantly do it to make it have muscle memory so that when you actually needed to utilize it with a student, it was there for you because you used it a lot. What we're going to do is we're going to go to page where it says meta model. On the back, you can either get with one person, you can get with a table, group. You're going to take turns looking at statements. These statements are examples of generalizations, deletions, distortions. You're going to identify the pattern. Is it a distortion? Is it a generalization? Is it a deletion? And then you're going to come up with an appropriate response. What's an appropriate response to the statement? Any questions? All right, let's get to it. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Good deal. So we're back. Let's talk about it. I saw a lot of writing. I saw a lot of questioning. Let's talk about it. How was that activity? What did you learn? What was your experience? What do I need to know? Was there any of them that were more challenging than others?
I think some we felt could fall under two different categories.
I'm glad you made that observation, right?
And I need to walk around carrying them.
She said many of them can fall into many categories, right? And you should walk around carrying it. I do walk around carrying it. I carry it in my mind all the time, right? And I've recognized that same thought was happening everywhere. Some of them will fall into multiple categories, right? The only question is, how are you going to attack it, right? For example, I was having a training, I'm going to say the district. I was having a training, and one of the teachers said, this administration sucks. Oh no, this administration never listens, right? Never listens, right? So the only question is, there's multiple ways that I can have that conversation. The first way I'm going to attack it is never, right? Never. Let me first figure out, is that even true? But in this case, guess what? They were adamant. And in my mind, I'm knowing can't be true, but they said no, they never listen. So now I need to go from a different way, right? So now there was a distortion that was happening, right? It went from being a generalization to a distortion. They are defining behaviors and saying that it has a meaning. So now my question is, what would listening to you look like? That make sense? What does listening to you look like? Because it's clear, now we're on two different pages. If you think they never do it, then more than likely they're doing something that you don't assign the label of listens to. And this happens a lot, right? So you may be having a statement that may be a distortion. It could be both, a deletion. Address it as a deletion first, then address it as a distortion. Address it as a generalization. Walk down that path. Was there any other ones that was challenging? What I'll say is this, and I would love some feedback because I think this is an important conversation that we're having, especially around language, because language can be so powerful, not just what's said, but also what's not said, right? And later we're going to talk about it in detail, but when we're thinking about the concept of capacity, have you ever been asked to do something that you didn't have the capacity to do? Right? You say every day, right? Every day. And so we have to build, if I'm going to have an expectation, then I should be part of building the capacity to complete that task. This is high-level stuff, right? This is in terms of language, the specificity of it, and a lot of the clients that you may be working with may not have a lot of language. Do you agree with that? Yes or yes? Right? So sometimes you're going to have to be able to have that conversation. They may say a generalization, and then you may be able to have to look for other cues to figure it out, where they're going with it. Does that make sense? Because everyone doesn't necessarily all have the same capacity. I would love to hear from you all. I would love to hear from your perspective on it in terms of the capacity for language within your groups. How does that sound in terms of, do you think that's a limitation at all in terms of this model? How so? Talk to me.
Like for a lot of our students who use sign language, some of the higher level, more specific vocabulary
Yes.
get generalized into a more simplified sign. So mad can be mad, angry, furious, irate, and oftentimes it would be utilized in a very similar sign, maybe with different body language or facial expressions, but the core word is just
Okay.
such a simplified version of the emotion oftentimes.
Yeah. And so what do you, in this, utilizing this model, how would we deeper dive into it if the generalization is kind of built into it, if that makes sense?
I think like you're saying, like asking more questions, you know, like
Yes.
a rating scale, you a little bit mad or you very, very mad?
I like that, right? Still simple, but now deep diving into it a little bit more to give you more information. Right here, then right there.
So my students, cheating is a big one right now. They
Okay.
call everything cheating, so they overgeneralize language because they don't know the other words for you did something bad. So everything is cheating. No, you lost the game because he was better at it. It doesn't mean he was cheating. You lost. Sorry. So a lot of times they just don't have the language, so we have to give them the language and model and practice it in different situations.
I love it because utilizing this, you're expanding their consciousness. But just by the conversation, you can figure out where they are. They're, oh, you don't have the language. These are the only words you have. And now there's an opportunity for me to expand your language through this conversation. But you realize it when you're starting to ask those questions. I think that's a great example, huh?
One more really
Sure, go ahead.
relevant recent one. I had a student tell me that his dad died, that he got hit by a car. And so the other kid in my class was like, did he get shot? And he was like, no, he got hit by a car. And I was like, what is just happening right now? That like, and these are kids that didn't have a lot of language when they came to me. So I was like, whoa, we're having like a back and forth conversation here. So I called the mom. I was like, you know, this could be a sensitive subject.
Yes.
You know, did his father pass away? He's telling me this story about him getting hit by a car. And she's like, no, I have no idea where he's getting this from. And it was like the end of the day, like getting on the bus, this conversation happened. So, you know, I'm diving into it more the next day and I'm like, hey, you told me dad died, hit by a car. I said, mom said no. Where did you see it? Did you see it on TV? Did you see it on YouTube? Like whatever? And he was like, no. And spells Roblox. And I was like, all right there, I'll let you all know. But when I called the mom, I was like, I don't know, maybe he doesn't know the sign for man. And it could have been he saw a man and he called everybody dad. Or, you know, so there are so many complex things that go into, maybe he doesn't know a different word. Died could mean I haven't seen him in a week. He's dead. Like, who knows what?
So I love what you're doing because even that line of thinking is taking it beyond a regular distortion of this equals that.
Yeah.
It's taking a word that may now be utilized in a way that it's not historically been done, right? So now there's even more opportunities, but that happens through conversation. And there's such a rich opportunity there to figure out where their worldview is even coming from, how they constructing these ideas, and there's a lot of opportunity to teach. I love that. Right here?
I was going to say something very similar, just as far as like when you have those holes in your language and trying to fill them in. You know, we had a student who said a teacher hit him, and it became a really big concern, like everybody involved and this and that, whatever. Finally to find out that when she walked by, she bumped his shoulder, and he didn't have the language to to explain that. You know, so sometimes when they do come to us and they say something happened, we have to figure out where that distortion is or where the overgeneralization is, even to a more bigger degree than students that have more language.
Now, I appreciate the fact that you even shared that, because how often do we, as adults, we may hear a student say something, and based on what they say, we may immediately get emotionally charged about it. They did what? As opposed to, so that even speaks to why it's important for us to consistently clarify so that we can get to proper understanding, right? Especially when we're dealing with a community that may be limited in terms of their language, right? As I was the assistant director of an alternative school on the west side of Chicago. Often they didn't have as much language, and I would have to unpack things and give them language, because it's not that they didn't have the capacity for language, they just weren't given as much of the opportunity for language. And this is the same thing with the special needs community. Sometimes we have to take these opportunities to expand language. Similar to when I was talking about my brother, we would go places and people would talk loud as if he was hearing impaired, or they would approach him like he had deficits that he didn't necessarily have. Imagine if everyone impacted him that way, how that would limit his capacity. So I appreciate the fact that you deep dive into it and you build the language through that process. So I think that's great modeling right there. Anyone else? Let's talk about it. Once again, the meta model, I think it's a very powerful tool, as you can see. All of us, often generalize, distort, and delete. And this is just you can utilize this as a tool to clarify information, to figure out how people are thinking. We're not going to do this exercise now, but I want you to take a quick snapshot of it, because I want you to do it for yourself. Identify one of your own limiting beliefs. Use the meta model to challenge the linguistic pattern of it, and then come up with a more empowering statement. Because sometimes we have limiting beliefs around what we think we're capable of, and we need to interrogate those thoughts. In order to regulate a class, we need to regulate ourselves. In order to be positive if you want positive students in a class, we must come from a positive space as well. We cannot teach and we cannot model that which we do not know, that which we do not practice. So what are some things that we can do? Communication stoppers. If you want to immediately stop a conversation from happening. 1, denying the responsibility of your own feelings. You irritate me. You make me mad, right? If you want to stop communication, make someone else responsible for your internal feelings. It tends to shut down communication. Diagnosing, judging, blaming, comparing. You are disrespectful. The reason why we consider it a diagnosis, they are not disrespectful, right? There's something that they're doing that's causing you a reaction. There's a particular reason why, and there's some desired outcomes that you want from it. They are not disrespectful. You don't listen. It communicates that they don't have the ability to listen, right? And if you're already concluding that, then I might as well shut down now and stop talking. Because you're telling me who I am and what I'm capable of. If I'm disrespectful, then I might as well continue being disrespectful. It shuts down communication. Demanding, threatening to force behavior. You don't talk to me like that. You better stop. Sometimes we exercise power over as opposed to harmonious communication. Now, there's a thing that used to exist, and we'll talk about it more in depth. It used to be a thing called deference. When you respected a person because of their position, they're a principal, they're an adult, that's less likely to exist today, right? So threatening someone in class, there's a rule called the law of requisite variety. It says the person who's most flexible in the space controls the space. So if I'm trying to control the space based upon power over, you better do this. If they don't, now what? Now they can flip a table. They can go to way more of an extreme than I can. So, but what I can do is communicate in a harmonious way, communicate my thoughts and my ideas, not saying you better do this, I'm going to make you if you don't, right? That's the power over. Deserve. You should be cut off. You should be suspended. that type of language comes from a space of judgment, and it shuts down communication. So I would warn, if you want to expand communication, utilize more restorative language. This is an exercise here. I want you to take the statements from harmful to restorative. We're going to take these harmful statements and we're going to shift them into more restorative statements. We often utilize language in a way that can escalate, can shut down, can make a person feel judged, right? Well, they feel judged as a result of your language, right? It's important for us to be able to communicate what we want to say, but communicate it in a way that's restorative. For example, the problem with you is you're disrespectful. Raise your hand if you ever heard a teacher say that. Let's be honest. That's one of the most overused ways. That's one of the most overused ones. And as I said earlier, 95% of all suspensions are from nonviolent actions. Therefore, actions similar to this. You're disrespectful. You don't listen, right? So, in a way to say that more appropriately, as an example, when you use this type of language, I feel frustrated because I value the respect that we're building as a team, right? Let me hear from you all. Why is that second statement very different from the first? Right? The back? I value, right? I value. Why else? Why else is it different? Right here?
It's not aimed at them, it's more aimed at yourself internally.
Yes. It's taking responsibility for your own feelings. Another hand was right here?
I was just going to say kind of the same thing, that you're not placing blame.
Mm-hmm. What else is it doing? Right here.
You might allow the student to see how it impacts you, how their behavior impacts you.
Yes. It's showing you the behavior because you're disrespectful. It's so ambiguous, right? It's showing you the language. It's showing when you use that type of language, I feel frustrated. Because why do I feel frustrated? Because I value the relationship. Because I value the respect that we have. Right? So now it explains the impact, and you can even add to it in terms of what is the next expectations. The inherent expectations is that we act as a team. As opposed to being ambiguous, which is really a distortion, now we're being a lot more clear with what's happening and what our expectations are, the impact, and why. Right? I think it's really important that if we're going to communicate how we're feeling as a result of something, then it's important for us to identify what it is and what we're expecting. All right? So we're going to take those harmful statements and shift them into more restorative statements. And some of them, they may be a bit challenging. I want you to think about the mindset that the person would be in. What is the underlying thing that they want to communicate? Because we often say things like this. What's the underlying thing they want to communicate, and what's a better way to say it? These are not students. These are things that we're saying as the adults, and we need to figure out a different way to say it. All right? Let's get to it. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. I'm hearing a lot of questions. I'm seeing a lot of activity here. So talk to me about it. How was the activity? Did you learn something? Was there any challenges? What questions do you have? Right here.
Well, I could not come up with a statement for who do you think you are? Because that is me. So I just could not come out of it. So that one I left.
I love it though, right? So now it's acknowledging. So when you're saying who do you think you are, what are you really saying? Because that in and of itself can be kind of ambiguous. So what is the intent? What are you saying? And we'll go here.
It's probably a level of disrespect that
Okay.
I'm feeling that the child or whoever.
Uh-huh.
Because this does not have to be directed towards a child. This is something I would say.
Right.
That I feel like I've been disrespected.
Because when a person says, who do you think you are, what is the next response? Me. Right? I'm trying to think of a positive response to that. Who do you think you are? Algenoy Alexander. So now what happens? It escalates. There's really nowhere to go because we started from a space of confrontation. Your hand was raised? I think you said.
Yeah, no, I think when I am thinking that, like, who do you think you are, in my mind it's kind of like, why did you choose to do that action?
Boom.
Is a lot of times why I'm saying that.
Yeah, right. So that there's an opportunity to go into that, right? What specifically is the action that you're deeming to be disrespectful, right? Or that, and what is it causing you to feel, and why, and what is the alternate act that you're expecting, right? Sometimes when we're saying these things, it's confrontational, and it's ambiguous, and it's going to escalate. There's no clarity in who do you think you are, right? So I think even approaching it from the frame in which she's looking at it, it allows you now to clarify. So at least they're clear around where you're coming from, and there's a clear path to restoration. There's really not a clear path to restoration on who do you think you are, right? Other than them seemingly feeling like they have to back down, especially in front of people. And if I need to feel recognized, or if I feel like I'm going to lose my connection because of what you said, I'm not going to lose this in order to make you feel better. Does that make sense? Good. Let's go to another one. What's some of the other challenges? Right here. Good. Yes.
So I feel like trying to use this language is challenging, period.
Yes.
So because I have not seen an example of where this actually caused a child to change their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, and I've seen it mostly in an elementary setting where a student is acting out or saying some of these things, you know, being disrespectful, whatever it is, they're saying some of these things, they don't want to do what the teacher's saying, and so the teacher will counter with, well, that makes me feel sad, like that makes me feel frustrated that you don't want to, but the student don't care in that moment about how you feel. They care about the reasons behind why they're doing that behavior. You know, and I feel like, I think, you know, some of us have paras in our room, or different things, like people that can be trained to kind of go through this with a student outside of the classroom setting, but just like during class, when something's going on, when a behavior escalates or something like that, in the moment, the teacher or the adult in the room saying statements like, well, I felt frustrated because I value respect. But in this classroom, if the student valued that already, they wouldn't be disruptive, like in that moment seems like. So I feel like either we're not using it correctly or at the right time or in the right vein, or we don't have a connection with that student in the first place to be able to use language where they can now, like, we can like connect, and we can have empathy for both sides.
For sure.
What I'm saying? So I feel like, how do we, because I feel like I see people use it without the wholeness of it. And so it's not working, I think.
Okay.
And so that's why this activity is challenging to me, because I haven't seen it being done successfully.
Sure. Right in the back. We definitely want to get into that in the back, and then we'll go here.
I was just gonna kind of say with that, I think it depends on
Let me go
the
here.
individual and the relationship. I can understand what you're saying, you haven't seen that. But I have some of my students that, like, they'll come in and boom, they're like, ah. I'm like, you feel better? Because they know they can come to me. One, I'm not gonna judge them. Two, yeah, because that's our other half as social workers, right? It is just the way it is a lot of times. And they know that they're in a safe space. Like, they can say something like that, and I'll say, do you feel better? It's either yes or no. Do you need more time to whatever? We can't always expect them in that moment to have, like, accept what we're saying, especially when they're younger, but we can then just keep modeling that so that they know that it's a safe space. Because some of these kids, like I'm talking about my older kids for sure, but since they were little, it's that they have that. They already know they can come in, they're in a safe spot, you say what you gotta say, we're gonna talk about it, and then we're gonna move on. But when they're little, you just keep, okay, and it's okay to say, like, that does hurt my feelings, let them know. And it's hard for anybody, even the adult, when you're in that situation, it's emotional and you're hurt or frustrated or whatever. But they don't realize it then, but I feel sometimes they do, because like with younger kids that we also have, I could say, that makes me feel sad when you say things like, I'm dumb, because you're not. When we worked on this, this, and this, you showed me, you know, whatever. It might not be right then is all.
I really appreciate the fact that even when I talked about the process of challenging the implicit bias, sometimes it's important to seek other perspectives to say, well, has this worked in any other environment, right? Because if we don't feel like that, sometimes the fidelity in which we approach it, we're not approaching it with the energy where it would work because we already don't feel like it's going to work. Because one thing we don't want to do is waste our time. And if I don't feel like something's going to work, the effort that I put into it may not be there. We're going to go here, and then I still have some other things to say. Right here.
I was just going to piggyback off what she was saying. I mean, I do think sometimes there's times where it's not working, but I think we should continue because the child or the other person may not be in the space to receive what you're saying at that moment, but maybe at another time. And I'm just thinking personally, my daughter had a situation with a teacher, and she shut down with that teacher, and I went to that teacher. I know my kids' teachers hate me because, you know, I'm that parent. But
How do you know they hate you? No, I'm just kidding. No, go ahead. That's good. Go ahead.
you know, the resolve was, I want you to have a restorative conversation with my daughter because she is that student saying, my teacher hates me, you know, and that's her truth. I don't believe he hates her. I don't feel that at all, but I needed him to recognize that and to have that conversation with her because that relationship is going to break her down, and I think we just need to continue to do these things. And when you have that space to have that one-on-one with the student to go over it, yeah, I agree with you. There's times, yeah, you're saying this, but the student's not ready to receive it at that moment.
There was a hand up in the back.
I was just saying there's a similar thing that we're doing. We call it give and take a moment, and I'll say, do you need a moment? And I'll literally put a timer on for a minute, let the kid just talk and talk and talk. And then they have to give me a moment when we can break down what they're saying and how I can respond to it. Okay, well, I understand that you feel this way. You are very angry. Let's look at how else you could behave next time this happens. Let's give you a different aspect, a different way to react to when you do become so emotional. Because a lot of kids just don't, you know, we don't know what their day was before they walked in the door. We don't know what they felt the night before. It's hard to give them perspective. You just have to give them an opportunity to release and then give them choices for the next time.
I love the fact that you said give them an opportunity to release and give them choice, right? So when we're thinking about saying our feelings, for example, I don't believe that every situation you're going to say I feel. But if you do want to communicate your feelings, which you're so disrespectful, is communicating an energy, and it's communicating the impact on your feelings. So if you're going to communicate that, then let's do it in an appropriate way, as opposed to doing it in a way that's going to escalate and cause it to be negative. But I don't think you should always say how you feel, because you're right. They may not particularly care about how you feel, but you should communicate what are the actions, why these actions don't work in this space, provide an alternative, and now you're giving them the opportunity to make a different choice. They may not always choose the right choice. So now it may be, well, now we have to take the next steps. If you choose not to adjust, then we're going to have to escalate it, which I don't want to do because I really appreciate you in class. So let's get it together. Can we do it? Can we work together? Because I really respect you. Make the adjustment. Does that make sense? Yeah. But if we're approaching it, I'm sad, and they're like, so what, right? So that doesn't always work, right? But it is important to identify the behavior. What is the impact of that? What do you need that behavior to be? And give them the option of making the adjustment before we escalate it to separating them from their education. There may be times where you may have to separate them for a moment and escalate it, and we're going to talk about systems of support next. But we want to make sure that we're being very clear in our communication. Your hand was up?
Well, I was just going to talk about, and the actual genuine feeling. Like some teachers are going to say, you make me feel frustrated, you know, Mary. And then the students are going to know which teachers are their safe places and which teachers are not necessarily their safe places.
Yes.
You know, like some teachers do, or some paras, or some people say, you make me feel frustrated, but they don't have that. It's not really genuine.
Yes.
Where other people go, that really, that really hurt.
It definitely can be that. And what you're speaking to speaks to the whole thing, the whole definition of restorative practices in the first place. It's the formal and informal ways in which we build those trusting relationships, right? So in that moment, there's harm there. And if we want to repair it, we have to have something that we're repairing. So this works within the framework of a school that is restorative. You know what I'm saying?
That's kind of what I was going to say. We kept going, yeah, but why are they doing that? What kind of programs do we have? What other supports can we pull in? Like we were ready to write a paragraph because we didn't want to just have a sentence and then go back to teaching.
Yes.
We were like, why is this happening? What else can we do? What resources do we have? What's the underlying issue? What are they trying to get out of this? And so we were wanting to write a paragraph because it's not all about just that one sentence, right? That's the first step. Something happens, you feel like you have to react immediately.
Yes.
But that's almost just like buying you time to figure out what else is going on and what really do you need to do next.
And I love the fact that you spoke of it in that way. A lot of you actually. This really isn't just about that one moment. It's really about a mindset, and it's about modeling. So if everyone is communicating from that space, so now you're modeling that to the teachers, right? I know it's actually time, but I want to say this really quick. Sometimes, and you may be able to relate to it, sometimes when I go into these schools, I see someone who's almost considered to be like a grandmother figure, and they can almost say anything. Smack you in the back of the neck, get to class. You ever seen that? And it works. The student chuckles, then they go back to class. And unfortunately, I'll tell them, though that works because of the rapport that you have in spite of your poor language, because you already have established rapport. The problem with that is if someone else models that behavior and they don't have the rapport, good luck, right? They'll get their heads knocked off, right? So it's important if we want to model and if we want to create a community, then we all should be using restorative language, restorative approaches, even if we have the ability, because of our rapport, to say something that sounds, out of line, and it works. It's working in spite of the fact that you're making a poor choice in language, because they're connecting to the underlying relationship that you have, right? So it's important, if we want to create that community, all of us need to be utilizing that same language so that a student can see when you're frustrated, when I'm frustrated, I can do what my teacher did, right? Because now we're modeling it and they're learning from you. It may not work in every instance, but if you consistently do it, you're providing a lot more opportunities for them to adopt the same communication. Or a teacher who may not have the language, by hearing you say it, they'll be reminded of the language that they have to utilize. I want you all to imagine what would a school look like if it consistently used restorative language, consistently changed harmful statements into more restorative, consistently utilized the meta model to ask questions, to figure out before we just implement some type of punitive punishment, what's happening, what's the underlying reason. Imagine how students can feel even more empowered because you didn't just give them the solution and tell them what to think, you asked them questions so that they can come up with some of the solutions themselves. This is the power of language, and I really appreciate us thus far. I am a couple minutes over, so we do have a 45-minute break for lunch. I think we're all back. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Good deal, good deal. So obviously, we just had lunch, and I know how it is to speak to people after they have eaten. So let's go ahead and stand up. Let's stretch out a little bit. Let's stand up and stretch out. Shake out a little bit. Now, remember, my philosophy is that which comes to me comes from me. And I always bring the energy. So for this last hour and a half or so of the training, we're going to be energetic, we're going to be engaged, and we're going to continue this conversation. Yes or yes? Yes. We're going to continue this conversation. Yes or yes? Yes. Good deal. In order to have a conversation, this portion is going to be really important in terms of engaging. I'm going to ask questions, and you all are the practitioners So your valuable feedback is critical for this conversation. So can we agree to that? Yes or yes? Yes. All right, good deal. Have a seat. So, another quote. One of the greatest things you can do to help others is not just share and give what you have, but to help them discover what they have within themselves to help themselves. Talk to your neighbor for about a minute. Talk about what this means and how this can relate to your practice. All right, let's talk about it. I would love to get your feedback. Oh. That's the first piece of feedback. Thank you. So, talk about it. One of the greatest things you can do to help others is not just to share and give what you have, but to help them discover what they have within themselves to help themselves. Talk to me.
So we're both parents at different journeys. She
Okay.
has younger children. I'm almost an empty nester. But you definitely learn this as a parent. We have to resist the desire to do it for our kids and not want them to experience pain or difficulty, but to help them discover their own power and ability to be and become. And they might not do it our way, but it's okay as long as it gets done.
I love that. As a parent, that's something that we often have to remind ourselves. Our job is to teach so that they can do it for themselves. Because one day, as you're so lucky to say, you're about to be an empty nester. I still have some time, so put some time in. Give me some other feedback. What else do you think? You all were talking. I saw some good stuff happening here. Give me some feedback from one of you all.
I was sharing that I find this more harder to do with adults than with students. I don't know exactly. Maybe it's like goes back to your first quote of like the repairing versus teaching in the beginning, but but supporting teachers and helping them understand their value in the classroom and how to change and adjust, or how to encourage them to go about a more restorative way. I find more resistance. I find, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but I feel like teachers, there's a level of fear of not being able to hold a boundary in your classroom, or not being able to, I don't know. But just,
No, you're doing a great job, by the way. What you're saying is great. I'm glad you mentioned it. Sometimes there is a resistance to implementing, and stop me if I'm not saying exactly, if I'm not getting to the spirit of what you're saying. Sometimes as educators, when we talked about the human needs, remember we talked about the human needs? The first human need was the need for certainty, the need for predictability. Sometimes as educators, as teachers, because we want to create that predictability, we want to know the classroom is going this way, this is going to happen, we shut down conversations fast. We're a lot more punitive because we're afraid if we allow students to grow, we allow them to give their voice, their choice, then we're going to lose control of the classroom. Does that kind of speak to it? Yes. And that's one of the fears. And I think that's critical what you're doing, because you could walk in and just do it yourself. But I do think it's important that you're teaching them the practices. And if you just keep going, give them specific strategies. A lot of the times we're telling educators to do something, but it's important for us to give them specific strategies, specific language, versus talk positive. Give them specific language as opposed to just telling them to question students. Give them the meta model. And I'm going to provide you with a few more strategies and techniques that you can share with teachers. What else? Talk to me. What else is this? Right here.
For me, I think about my own children. I know I try to instill in them to become problem solvers and critical thinkers.
Yes.
Because I feel like with this generation, they just want things instant. And they don't want to think about the process of how to get there. And I tell my children all the time, you can be very successful in life if you can solve problems. I said, I'm a smart person, but I said, I'm a problem solver.
Yes.
That's what I did, solve problems. You know, amongst many other things. But, I just want them to have that so that they can help themselves and not always be dependent on me. And it is hard sometimes where I try to make them think for themselves. And when they do, I always point it out, like, that's
sure.
a good problem solver.
Thank you. And it makes sense, right? I think that the reason why when I look at this, it means a lot is because as an educator, I truly believe this really is the purpose of education. This is the purpose of having schools. The purpose is so that we can help them discover what they have within themselves to help themselves, right? It's not for us to do everything for them. When they leave our places, when they leave our schools, when they leave our learning communities, they should be more equipped to understand their value, be more equipped to empower their own lives, be more equipped to empower their own communities so that they can make things better. If they don't get the feeling that what they're learning in school is going to allow them to be more powerful for themselves and for their families and for their communities, then they're more often than not going to reject it or dismiss it. So I think it's important for us to keep this in mind when we're thinking about the purpose of classes, the purpose of classrooms, the purpose of learning communities. It's not for us to give them things. It's to help them to discover the power that they have so that when they leave you, they still have that power. It's a question. It goes into this question, which is, what is effective classroom management? Let's talk about it. What is effective classroom management? What do you think? What is the purpose of a classroom, and what is the purpose of classroom management? And what makes it effective? Someone from this table, right here, go ahead.
Just like creating a culture of respect.
Okay.
That they feel safe and feel able to grow and learn.
Creating a culture of respect, for sure, so they can grow and learn. What else? What else is the purpose of a classroom? What are we doing right here?
Like systems.
Okay.
Place that are managed
Okay.
smoothly.
Creating things so the systems, creating systems so that things can run smoothly. What type of things need to run smoothly? What type of things? Transitions, okay. Okay, so making sure that they know how to operate and making sure that they know how to operate within the classroom in a way that's not chaotic. Good deal. What else is the purpose of classroom management?
Listening skills.
Listening skills. Why is listening skills necessary?
Kids are going to listen and, their work and, again, teaching respect.
Okay.
The teacher's talking, you listen to them.
Okay.
Take notes.
Okay.
And do your homework. Kind of like,
Learning how things go, the flow of things, that respect, processes, when to talk, when not to talk, how to engage socially, maybe? Okay, what else? What else are the reasons why we're doing what we're doing? Right here. Independence. Speak to that. Independence. Why?
Well, because you don't want students relying on you to tell them to do something every single day. You want them to grow, and like I always say, I don't want you to need me.
Yes.
So my job is to make sure you don't need me.
So at some point, I got it. So the independence, so that they can one day not necessarily need you. When they go to the next class, they shouldn't still be holding on to their first grade teacher, right? They should be able to transition to the next space, right? What else? Right here.
Maybe to help teach problem solving or conflict resolution.
Okay.
Strategies.
Okay.
It's part of that human growth kind of thing we were talking about previously.
Yes.
All of those concepts need to be in place.
Okay. So to learn how to engage with one another. And when there is a conflict, knowing what to do. I love it. I love it. What else? I want to exhaust this. Tell me. I want to know, what is the purpose of classroom management? What are we doing it for?
I'm going to share one more. This actually, we talked about it earlier. Self-advocacy.
Self-advocacy.
To advocate, like I'm a vision teacher, advocating for the visual needs.
Okay. To learn how to advocate for them. You don't know how many teachers, how many students, parents, a lot of us don't necessarily practice self-advocacy, right? And that leads individuals to have burnout in terms of teachers, students to drop out for students, parents to not get involved and disengage, right? That lack of advocacy happens for all stakeholders, and it's having a negative impact on our community. So thank you for that. Give me another one. What are we doing it for? The expectations. Talk to me right here.
I'm going with it. If you have effective classroom management, your communication.
Mm-hmm.
You have a good communication model. Because it doesn't always necessarily mean that kids are sitting down and being quiet, listening to the teacher.
Uh-huh.
When I had
and maintain that with independence.
I love it. The reason why I'm asking you these questions is because when we're thinking about effective classroom management, we have to think about ways in which we're going to communicate those expectations and ways in which we're going to build the capacity for those expectations to actually be met, right? And that's often done through simple, very simple, succinct messaging. So what I thought of was, how can I articulate all the things that you all just said? And if I'm talking to someone, a young person, if I'm talking to a staff member, how can I communicate all those expectations in a very simple way? So this is what I come up with, this is what I came up with, and we can come up with our own ways. But for me, effective classroom management is the process in which you model, educator, and empower the students to build trusting relationships with adults. Is that included? Important. Appropriately socialize with peers and learn how they learn. Learn how you learn in terms of education. What's the best way for me to learn math, reading, so on and so forth? How do I socialize with peers? How do I get my needs met in the midst of other individuals that's looking to get their needs met? And how do I build trusting relationships with the adults that I'm around? Do you think that encapsulates all the things that we just talked about? Do they fall within those three? Can they? Okay. It's important. You may want to make sure when you're thinking about your school systems, how do you communicate in a simple, effective way your expectations? Something that's very simple, three very simple phrases that should be easily understood, right? You want to make sure that you're doing this in your classroom, communicating what your expectations are. So how do we do so? How do we create environments where students thrive? We do it based upon systems of support. The reason why restorative practices and formally and informally teaching them in classrooms and schools now is more important than ever is because there are certain things that are not here now. In the past, we relied on systems that existed outside of school in order to reinforce those thoughts. Social scientists say that when you have an organization or a family or a group of people and it exceeds the size of 150, as soon as it gets bigger than 150, you have to have some sort of mythology, some sort of shared expectations, some sort of laws that govern the group, or else the group will fall into chaos. So if we don't have shared mythology, shared expectations through religious practices, shared laws, similar to the Constitution, it may be through church, it may be through synagogue, it may be through mosque, it may be through a wide variety of ways. But if we don't have those systems, it's very difficult for any group that's larger than 150 to survive. Most of the schools we come from are much larger than 150. Would you agree with me? Yes or yes? Much larger, right? But in the past, the systems in which we were taught, I remember when I was younger, there was this concept of it takes a village to raise a child. Raise your hand if you've heard that before. It takes a village to raise a child. My father told me, my mother told me a long time ago about they would be able to walk down the block, and if they did something wrong, the neighbor would be able to pull off a belt or get a switch, right, and correct that child, right? My parents talked about church. I remember I grew up in the church, and I felt like I was there all day on Sunday, 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night. And then I would go to Bible study on Wednesdays. And my parents told me about doing their time where they went from revival to revival to revival, week after week after week. And it was during those practices where they learned, how do I interact with adults, right? How do I interact with my peers? Is stealing wrong? That's where they learned the ideas around expectations. So then, by the time a student came to school, you could almost rely on the fact that they've probably been embedded with certain philosophies. The only thing we have to do is keep the ball rolling. We live in a day and age now where we're more diverse than ever. And there's benefits to that diversity. There's benefits to the fact that now we have a lot of different thoughts and ideas. The challenge with that is now we can't make the assumption that the students are coming into the building with the ideology or the right expectations. And because of that, now we have to play a part in saying, how are we going to build their capacity to meet the expectations that we have? I believe this is done through the tiered system. Raise your hand if you've seen this system, this pyramid before. Well, if you haven't, let's talk about it. On the base level, that's the tier 1. That's what you do for all students. This is where you develop the social and emotional capacity of your staff, of your students, of the parents, of all stakeholders that's going to be involved in the child's education. This is done through restorative mindset, restorative language, and establishing expectations across the entire organization. The next level will be where you manage the challenging relationships, because it doesn't matter how perfect things are. There's still going to be challenging relationships. That's where you have your restorative conversations and your affinity groups. Tier 3, where you have where you repair serious acts of harm. That's done through restorative conferencing, restorative circles, restorative boards. Ultimately, through this process, it's a process of keeping, making, and building peace. And it's doing in 3 tiers. So let's talk about Tier 1. Tier 1, the purpose of Tier 1 is to develop the social and emotional capacity of all students and staff. That's the relational practices within a classroom and across the entire school. So what does that include? That includes, this is where you establish your all-school expectations and your norms. What's expected to happen for every student in our building? How do you communicate those expectations? Those expectations can be met through consistent assemblies. Raise your hand if your school has assemblies, right? Assemblies, classroom circles. They can be met through posting images, language, having those expectations posted in the gym, posted in the bathroom, posted in the classrooms, so that not only are those words being said, but there's visual imagery around to support it as well. Supportive physical environment. This is where you all are the content experts, right? There are some individuals, if a person is hard of hearing, or a person is maybe blind, or if a person has some sort of disability, what environment will be there to support them, right? You want to make sure that everything is in place in order to make sure that you're meeting those needs. Everyone in the special needs community has to make sure that those environments are effective based upon that particular population. Now, you also want to make sure, what are the all-school expectations? Differentiated instruction. Everyone doesn't learn the same. So it has to be an all-school expectation that there's differentiated instruction occurring inside of the classroom. What else happens on Tier 1? Your social emotional education. Now, what is social emotional language? What is social emotional learning? That is where you build the capacity of your staff, of your students, of your parents to meet those expectations. We can tell a student show up on time, but if we haven't had any social emotional learning centered around personal management, we can say, I expect you to be able to reduce conflict. But do we have any training centered around conflict resolution, right? If we're expecting our students to do certain things, then it's important for us to make sure that we've helped to build their capacity. How is this done? This is done through specific trainings or conversations. For example, this will be an example of building the capacity. Professional development, staff trainings, centered around language, centered around mindset. This is done for your entire population to ensure that you have the capacity to build and talk with your students appropriately. Social emotional learning for your students. That can be a set-aside training. That can be a specific training centered around anti-bullying. There can be a specific training centered around conflict resolution, anger management. These are set-aside trainings outside of the specific curriculum where you teach them how to meet the expectations for themselves and their community. If we're not explicitly doing it, then we have to make the assumption that it's not being done as a school. So we have to have those things in place. Outside of the specific set-aside training, we have to make sure that it's also embedded within the curriculum. If I'm going to learn how to reduce conflict or how to have conflict resolution as a set-aside training for my students and as a staff, opportunities should also be embedded within the curriculum so that they could actually practice it. I remember there were times when I was a math teacher, I would specifically deliberately show up and I would give a wrong answer on the board just to see how they would respond and then teach them the appropriate ways to respond, just so they can see me make a mistake. And just so they can see me say, oh, well, I make mistakes. And it's okay to make a mistake, right? Any lesson that I wanted them to learn independently, I made sure that I embedded it within my normal, regular curriculum. And this should be done across the entire school. Next, you want to make sure that there's restorative language and a restorative mindset response to minor disruptions. How do we respond to some of the minor things that happen inside of the classroom? Are there some classroom circles? Are there restorative conversations? Is there a peace corner in the classroom, right? These are things that we do across the entire school that we agree upon. And this is where your tier 1 system, when I say tier 1, once again, this is what you do for the entire population of your school. If you do this, 85% or so of your students won't necessarily need those additional supports. Some of those acts of harm will be reduced and eliminated if you have your tier 1 systems of support in place. So I want you to quickly have a conversation amongst yourselves. I want you to think about your schools. Think about your systems. What's in place to proactively address student, staff, and parents' social and emotional needs? What do you currently have in place on a proactive level? What's in place to build the social and emotional capacity? Is there more that can be in place? So if you're having expectations of your students, what's in place to build their capacity to meet it? If you expect them to communicate appropriately, what programs are in place that's teaching them how to do so? All right? Let's get to it. Right, if you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. So let's really get into it. I think this is an opportunity to really have a robust conversation. We have individuals from a wide spectrum of places, so you can kind of share out some of the things that you're doing. So when you think about your school systems, what is in place to proactively address the students, staff, and the parents' social and emotional needs? What's in place? Right.
We talked about how we feel like most schools have systems in place for students. Yeah, other type of behavior, type school-wide programs where we have the expectations established and things like that. I think the biggest challenge a lot of schools, our schools included, is for staff and parents. The tier 1 supports for our staff and for our parents are pretty non-existent.
Wow. So you say that you feel like you have those things in place for students,
We do.
but it's a challenge having them in place for staff and parents. Does that resonate? Is that similar for everyone else? Okay. I think it is important because when you have that imbalance, then you're putting a lot of the work. If you're not providing that social emotional needs of the staff as well as the parents, then ultimately the school suffers. So for those who do have it then, let's talk about some things that we could put in place for teachers. What are some things that could be in place for teachers to help build their meet their social and emotional needs? What are the social and emotional needs of a teacher or a staff or an adult in the learning community? I think that's important to talk about. When we talk about right here.
So we do weekly team meetings at each of our levels, so that collaboration piece, that communication piece, making sure we're all on the same board, moving forward. We also meet weekly to talk about students' through our data and documentation system.
Okay.
So I think that collaboration helps provide what our teachers need just in regards to feeling part of a team and involved and getting the support and resources that they have around them.
Okay. I think it's important for even educators, for all staff, to realize that sometimes we need to meet our needs. We need to meet those human needs, even outside of what we're doing for students. The need for us to connect as a staff and do things socially. From the need for me to get recognized for the things that I do, right? When those needs are not being met, then it can have a detrimental impact on the student, on the learning community, right here?
We have a new principal this year. In our weekly newsletter that goes out to staff, she encouraged shout out.
Okay.
That's one way that we encourage recognizing each other beyond just the day-to-day.
Nice.
We're doing a book called Better Together.
Okay.
So that's also helping us navigate getting to know some of our colleagues other than just their grade level or the role that they serve.
The book called A Better Together?
The book is called Better Together.
Okay.
And last year we had seed groups.
Okay.
Which was good as well. That's for the equity and diversity.
Okay. Nah, say your hand up.
It's a little unique for us because we are citywide teachers.
Okay.
And so we're not always together, but I think trying to pair brand new teachers with experienced teachers, you know, just helping, because how you say the burnout and how we're losing teachers, I think that's really good to, you know, be able to address that, you know, so that your newer teachers feel comfortable. And then not only that, your more experienced teachers, they can share what they've learned. And that can also help them as well to be able to, you know, share out and help someone else.
I think that also helps to build the capacity of both. What I found is when you have an experienced teacher working with a newer teacher, there are new techniques, new strategies that can be learned that the more experienced teacher can learn from the newer teacher and vice versa. So both of them can be simultaneously building each other's capacity. So I think there's definitely value in that. So yeah.
I don't know if this applies, but at our organization where we work, we have standards of behavior.
Okay.
And we have accountability, innovation, integrity, collaboration, and underneath all of these are different behaviors that are expected of all staff. And then if somebody does not see somebody doing these behaviors, we can have a stub your toe conversation with them, and it's scripted so that everybody feels safe when they're in these difficult adult conversations.
Yes.
And then part of it is we also have something on our intranet called Caught Living the Standards, and people can submit things that they see other staff members doing, so that we are always managing up each other with, hey, I saw you do that with that student, good job, or I saw you do this with your parents, good job. And I think it builds a culture of, you know, accountability, integrity, innovation, and then collaboration among all of the people that work there. And this is expected of everybody. So it's very similar to that, but it is very much on an adult level, so that if we are doing our job as employees at NIA, then we will hopefully love our job and then do the job that we need to do with the students.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the barriers, some of the barriers to implementing the appropriate Tier 1 supports is often things may not be done with the level of fidelity. And the reason why things may not be implemented with a level of fidelity is because educators are given the opportunity to operate in isolation, right? So if you have a teacher or if you have a support staff who's not good at a particular thing, if they're not if they're allowed to be in their classroom and not partner with another teacher, not partner with support staff, then they're able to flounder in isolation. And they may need some additional supports, right? And they don't get the benefit of connecting with a more seasoned and a newer teacher. They don't get the opportunity to work together, see the strengths, see the opportunity areas, and merge them. So it sounds like you all have a system in place to kind of help that. So I think that's great, right here.
I think like in general ed, you know, we have bigger schools, bigger populations, and like high school have department supports, and then like at the elementary level they have their pod support. But I feel like in the deaf ed, kind of the special ed or deaf ed, that lack of community and that information sharing happens a lot less sometimes, because I think teachers are overwhelmed with writing their IEPs, they're using all their extra time focused on IEPs and focused on paperwork aspect of it.
For sure. I worked in, I mean, I was working in high school, and sometimes it felt like the work of having to do the IEPs and having to do that extra work for the special needs students, sometimes it did allow them to work in isolation, right? To not have those relationships. So I think it's important to be deliberate and intentional about including the entire staff working together consistently, as opposed to having one community here, one community there. One question I do have, though, is what's in place to build the social and emotional capacity? Because you mentioned something that was interesting. You can articulate that there's a challenge that's going on, and the expectation can be that we have to have a conversation around that. But what is in place to build the ability to have the appropriate conversation? Because I found that when you don't have the ability or the language, then you may just not have the conversation. Right here.
So we do, every once in a while, it's very beneficial for us to do role playing with each other.
Okay.
You know, we have a script for this one type of conversation and stuff you're told, where you say something nice about the person, and then you say, I saw you not living the standards by this way, and then you wonder, I'm so excited to work with you in the future. I'm sure that we can partner together. And that's it. It's not supposed to be a conversation where it's back and forth. It's a, hey, I saw you do this. I know that, you know, these are our standards, and,
Yes.
and you know, you didn't, you know, greet me in the hall. Just remember when we're walking back, you know, just say, hey, how are you? That makes me feel so good. Thank you so much. And so we practice those. And if we don't practice those, then it is difficult to have these conversations. And, you know, so many people come to me as the administrator and say, well, so-and-so did this. And I'll say, well, did you tell them? No. Okay, what do you think you need to do? Have a conversation, that's right. And I can't go and tell somebody that, hey, you didn't do this. Because when I do that, then they know somebody came to me and tattled, and I am talking to this person over here. And it never ends well for me. It never does. Let me tell you. So I don't get into the middle of those. But I do become a leader and have a leader-supported conversation when somebody has gone to another person, say, more than 2 times. It's the 3rd time now this is the same thing has happened. Then we have a conversation, all 3 of us, and then I enter into that discourse that they're having.
Yes.
And now I know about it, officially know about it. And then I can have another conversation with that other person. So I excuse the person that started the conversation, and I say, okay, we're having trouble here. How can I help you? What do we need to do?
That sounds like empathy and then advocacy, right? You're listening, you're getting information, you're empowering them, and then you're advocating as well. Sometimes advocacy may look like, hey, I believe in support, and I know that you do have the ability to solve this issue. Why? Because I've implemented trainings to give you the tools, right? And sometimes advocacy can look like, let me get involved in the conversation. So it can look, you know, it can look different based on the situation, but what you're modeling is excellent there. Imagine if all of the schools had similar leadership as what you're displaying. There was a system in place. You expect your teachers to have the language, but you've also provided them with scripts. You've also practiced role play, right? So that when they actually need the skill, the muscle memory is there, right? When the parent comes up and they're upset, the parent is already equipped and they're not taken off guard, and now there's not more harm being created, right? And that's where we have that's that tier 1 system, where these are our expectations. This is how we're teaching those expectations. This is how we're reinforcing those expectations. And that's where that consistency comes in. So I appreciate that comment, right? What are some more things that could be in place? Obviously, you just articulated some great ones. What are some more things that could be in place? Let's speak to your students. What are some things that could be put in place to help build their capacity to meet the needs, to meet their capacity to meet your expectations? This is where we have to do some thinking, right? Some There's a lot of different SEL programs. There's Second Step, there's 7 Habits, right? Where we actually implement it across the entire school. We can share a resource. We can actually communicate after this, and we can talk about different all-school programs that you can put in place just to make sure that we're consistently giving our students the information so that if they should choose to utilize it, it builds their capacity, right? So these are the important things that we want to put in place. If we do so, 85% of your challenges typically are reduced, right? Show me a school that's in disarray. Show me a school where there's staff complaining. Show me a school where there's high turnover, and I can show you where those tier 1 systems of support are not in place, right? But even if you do things perfectly, there's still going to be a percentage of your students that need some additional supports. The tier 2 systems is designed to manage more difficult behaviors and the disruptions. This is the collaborative process of addressing unmet needs. You may be working with your students on a tier 1. You may find that there's 5 to 10 students that still need some additional supports. They've been engaged with the SEL trainings, right? You've had conversation with them by stepping outside of the classroom, and they still need some additional supports. This is where you do the collaborative effort. What does it look like? It looks like targeted SEL groups. You may have a group for a group of students who may have anger management issues, right? You may have a group for individuals for grief support. I remember at my school, we were having some challenges in the classroom, right? And through conversations, what I found out was some of our students were losing some of their friends, and they were bringing that conversation to the classroom. So what I did was I set up a grief support group to deal with the trauma of losing your friends. So now they could have those conversations outside of the classroom so they wouldn't monopolize the time inside the classroom and be disruptive, right? So it's important to make sure we have those targeted social and emotional learning groups to support those students who need additional supports. Restorative conversations. They may need those restorative conversations. They can be teacher to student. They can be peace circles. Raise your hand if your school does peace circles. Okay.
But let's clarify, some of us are not in school buildings, so I don't want you to think that.
Okay, gotcha.
Not being done.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Because you're like, oh, they don't?
Okay, got it. So implementing peace circles, right? This can be done across any population, right? Problem-solving circles. This is where you all would be of a great benefit. I remember every morning I would meet with a handful of my staff. We would call it a standing meeting, right? Because once again, we would stand up. And the more you stand up, those meetings don't take as long. So we would literally talk about what are some of the issues that we're confronted with? What are some of the issues and challenges that we're having in the school, right? With specific students. And then we would problem solve around what we're going to implement about that particular student. It kept us abreast of exactly what was going on. That would include myself. That would include maybe a teacher, the social workers, some of the support staff. It wouldn't include everyone, right? But it would be a brief, small circle of people that we would consistently meet with for a problem-solving circle. So that would be your tier 2 systems of support, which is really put in place to meet those additional challenges. Those students who are not necessarily responding to the general messages that you're putting out there for everyone. A critical skill that I think is important to have is the ability to have a restorative conversation. And I think it's important to have a format for that because sometimes people think they're having restorative conversations and then the student walks away even more upset, even more angry, right? So it's important for us to have a format. So when it comes to a restorative conversation, it works like this. The first thing is you want to understand what happened. When we're talking about what happened from that student's perspective. I may ask, so what happened? Can you tell me more? How do you feel? And I want to get as much detail from that student's perspective as possible. Next, I want to understand why it happened so I can get to the root cause. I would ask questions like, so what led up to that situation? So before that happened, walk me through what happened before that. Right before there was a fight, walk me through what happened. What were you thinking at that time? What were you feeling at that time? Because I'm trying to get to the why. Before I even make any assessments, no judgment. I'm strictly fact-finding, trying to find information. So that's why I understand why. The next is understanding the impact. How did you feel when it happened? How do you feel now? So that we can fully get the impact of what is the impact on the other person, right? So we want to get the full impact, and after that, that's when we want to create an agreement. When you want to create an agreement, you use words like, so how could you have approached that situation differently? As opposed to you coming up with the answer and then expecting them to implement it, often they can be creative, and what comes from their minds are more likely to be implemented. So how could you have approached that situation differently? What could you do to help that situation from happening in the future? Right? What needs to be done in order to repair the harm that's caused? I was speaking with with an individual in here, and they was mentioning the fact that often when there is a challenge in the classroom, the student leaves the classroom, and then they come back to that same space without necessarily apologizing to the teacher. Have you all seen that before? Right? And the teacher gets pretty upset because they feel like they're not supported. What I found is if the entire staff is trained on how to have a restorative conversation, then there's a lot more trust, right? So if I trust that if my student was sent out of the class and they're having a full restorative conversation, that conversation includes impact and it includes an agreement, by the time they come to me, I may not necessarily feel like, well, I have to be engaged because I don't feel like I'm being dismissed, right? There may be times where you may want to re-engage and include the teacher in that agreement. But when everyone is trained on how to have a restorative conversation, and I trust that you took me into consideration when you sent the student back, there's a lot less pushback on behalf of the teacher, right? But it is important that we know how to have that restorative conversation. You have any questions on that process? Right here, good.
How when you have a student that won't necessarily give you anything back? You know, they won't talk, they won't answer those questions, or they just kind of, you don't really get anywhere with those.
Let me see. Let's talk about it. Bow. Let's talk about it. Well, for one, every meeting isn't necessarily going to go smooth. That's just the reality of it. So the first thing that I do is I try to listen, right? I want to listen, I want to express empathy, and I want to respond to the person's feelings as valid, right? Even if I disapprove of their actions, right? So let's talk through it. So if a person is not giving me feedback, sometimes I might just want to sit in silence for a little while. There may be times where I implement what's called reality testing. Reality testing is, I'll give you an example. If a student is not engaging, now I have to show them that if we don't have an appropriate conversation within this amount of time, and I want to solve this issue, right? I want us to work together. I believe that we can have this conversation. Unfortunately, if you and I don't have this conversation, if we don't come to a resolution, then it's going to have to escalate to the dean of students, or it may escalate to getting the parent involved. But I want to actually solve that between you and I. Can we do that together? That tends to reality test. You're constricted by time and the reality that if we don't solve it, it can escalate to the next space. Does that make sense? Another thing that I do, once again, you want to make sure that you're empathetic. Focus on the behavior and the choices, not necessarily the person. Sometimes when a person does something, we bring the energy of judgment to the space, as opposed to identifying the needs and the obligations. If our goal in a restorative conversation is to figure out the needs, because even the person that caused harm, often that harm is done as a result of them being a victim in another situation. And if we're not acknowledging that and trying to, in the process of figuring out what is the underlying reason, then the rapport is broken and they're going to consistently do the same acts over and over again. Refocus and move on. If they consistently bring up something else on topic, acknowledge it and get back on track. Brainstorm. Make sure that everyone is involved in the process of coming up with a solution. I know we're the adults, but the rapport that you build in the community that you build when you include students as part of repairing the harm, let them come up with some of the answers on brainstorming the solution, because ultimately they're going to have to be the ones to keep that agreement. There's a technique called perceptual positioning about that. I use this often. Perceptual positioning is a technique that involves viewing a situation from different perspectives in order to gain new insights and understanding. This is the way that it's done. So initially, when a person comes in and they're in conflict with someone, my initial piece is to have a conversation around what happened, what is their experience, and get their full perspective, their emotions, their feelings, entirely from their perspective. After I do that, and I say, okay, I'm glad you gave me your perspective. I understand where you're coming from. My next step is to say, the person you're in conflict, this may be difficult, but the person you're in conflict with, walk me through their perspective. Now, what you tend to get is there may be some resistance, and they may go right back to their thinking. No, I get it, that's what you think. Walk me through why do you think they did what they did? And then walk them through that full perspective. Get them to step into the shoes of the person that they're in conflict with. There's two reasons. One, it's a dissociative technique, right? If you can get a person, when a person is inside of their own head, that's when the emotions is the most heightened. If you can get them to fully exhaust that and now get them to step into the mindset of someone else, that can reduce their emotions and their anger. And it sets up peer mediation, or it sets up a restorative conversation with that other person, because now they're starting to look at it from that perspective. After they've exhausted the perspective of the person they're in conflict with, if I have time, then I'll step into another perspective. So if a person was a fly on the wall, or if the camera, what would the camera tell me? What would the fly on the wall, how would they see it? And get them to see it from another perspective, observing the two individuals that are in conflict. Exhaust that perspective. And if you have time, the most powerful piece is the last one. That's from the perspective of a coach. If you were tasked with solving this issue, reducing this conflict, how would you do it? Look at this from the perspective of a coach. Now, you've taken them out of their anger. You've expanded their consciousness so now they can connect to the person they're in conflict with. They see how it's impacted the entire community, fly on the wall, and now they've started the process of thinking about it from a problem-solving perspective as a coach. If you consistently utilize that and teach that to your staff as well as your students, imagine how much conflict can be reduced just by giving them this strategy and this technique. Due to time, what I would love, let me see, I don't have much time. A strategy that you can do in your spare time when you go back to your offices, when you go back to your prospective schools. This is a strategy that I think is really great. You can form groups and actually practice perceptual positioning strategies. You as an individual may come up with something that, a time when you were in conflict with someone, a time that you had a conflict, a minor or a serious conflict, and allow the other person to walk you through the various perspectives, right? And then at the end, that's when you would get feedback and you would observe exactly how that process went, right? So I think it's important for us to practice this. We're not going to do it today due to time, but perceptual position is a powerful technique that I often use. I was on the west side of Chicago. Students would be highly upset, but when I walk through that process of fully engaging, respecting their issue and their challenge, now I get them to step outside of their own shoes. Let's talk about the perspective of the other person. How do you think this impacted the community? How do they see it? And now let's think about this from the perspective of a coach. How can we repair the harm? How would you fix it? It's a powerful technique if we should choose to use it. So really quick here, I want you to talk amongst yourselves. Think about your schools. What is in place for those students who need those additional supports? Is it anger management? Is it grief counseling? Have you partnered with some external organizations? What is currently in place for those students who need additional supports? If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. So once again, when we're thinking about our tier 2 systems of support, just really quick here, I want you to throw out some ideas. What are some things that you have in place that you think is unique to the school that you may visit or the learning community that you're a part of that you think will be valuable to the space to address some of the needs of those students who need some additional supports? Right, sure.
I mean, we have a behavior team, so our group that comes here brings the stuff back, and we meet together, and these kids that we continuously see coming up on some of these weekly white binder discussions, like we'll sit down, get around the table, and problem solve, you know, what additional supports we can put in place, ISRC referrals, outside therapy referrals, you know, better communication with parents about what's going on.
So once again, you have your teams in place. You do referrals for therapy. What else? What else do we have? Do we have any schools that may be affiliated with, have affinity groups, anger management, grief counseling for specific students? Do we have any of those groups here? Or any of our schools have those groups? I think it's important to note, especially the world that we're living in now, a lot of our students are dealing with additional sets of trauma, right? That they may be acting out as a result of those traumas. So I think it is important for us to start thinking about the type of groups that we should put in place, right? If we don't have anger management, because 100% of our students are not just going to walk around angry, right? But there are some students that have appropriate levels of anger based upon their circumstance, right? And if we're not there to help them process it through some sort of an additional support, then what are we expecting that anger to manifest into, right? Then it may turn into a tier 3, where we have to repair a serious act of harm. It's the collaborative process in repairing and connecting, right? It's typically in the school code of conduct, it's the persistent levels of 1, 2, 3, and then everything above 3, if we're familiar with the code of conduct. But it's important to note that in any school community, a percentage of your students will have some sort of serious act of harm, right? And it's important for us to have a system to repair it. That may be restorative conferencing, an alternative to suspension education, peer mediation, which I've just implemented within several districts in the area, implemented peer mediation, class conferences, healing circles. This re-engagement meeting is really important. It speaks earlier to the conversation I was having earlier around when a student does something and it's time for them to be re-engaged back to the school community. They've been suspended, they've been out 5 days, they've been out 2 days, 3 days, and then they come right back into the classroom. Do you think that there needs to be some type of repair happening between them and their learning community, between them and the teacher, right? Between them and the entire community, right? It's important, how are we going to re-engage them back into the classroom, right? Even if even if they were out of the classroom for a moment for detention because of some harm that occurred in the classroom between that student and the teacher, how are you going to re-engage that student back in? This is where you have to make sure that you have those systems in place. When we think about what we are going to do, it's important for us to understand the concept of logical consequences. Raise our hand if we've heard of logical consequences. Logical consequences are structured learning opportunities that help individuals recover their self-controls and make constructive choices that help preserve the integrity of the individual and the community. So ultimately, it should do 2 things. It should stop the behavior, and 2, it should provide an action that recalls the individuals to the rules, reinstates the limits, and teaches alternative behaviors. Sometimes when people think about restorative practices, they're a little bit afraid of implementing it because they think that suspensions are off the table. You can't suspend students anymore. You can't expel a student. The reality is there are times when a suspension might be the most appropriate thing, right? An expulsion may be appropriate, but the question is, what was the process that you went through in order to get to that suspension? And does that suspension include an action that recalls the individual back to the rules reinstates the limits, and teaches an alternative behavior. So when you think about logical consequences, they should have these things in place. They need to be respectful. Make sure that they're clear and firm and you're not sarcastic. I've seen educators, because they've been in their feelings, when it's time to implement the consequence, they'll do it in a way that's disrespectful. They'll do it in a way that's sarcastic because it's almost like it's their get back, right? We have to speak directly, often quietly to the student. It's not about putting on a show. And it focuses on the deed and not the doer, right? It focuses on the action and what we're going to put in place to repair that harm. And make sure that it's relevant. It has to have a cause and effect. If we're going to implement some sort of consequence, it has to relate to what they actually did, right? It can't just be the hardest thing that we've ever come up with, strictly as a revenge technique, but it doesn't connect the student back to what they did. We want to make sure that it identifies the impact of breaking the rule. What is the impact of showing up consistently late to school? What is the impact of violence? What is the impact of using inappropriate language? And how am I going to have an activity that connects you back and reinstates those rules? We want to make sure that it's realistic, right? It has to be reasonable. It has to be based upon that person's capacity and developmental level, right? Giving a third grader no recess or giving a third grader no playtime for a month is not realistic and it's inappropriate time frame. You also have to be prepared to make sure that you follow through. Don't say you're going to do something and not do it. Right? It has to be respectful, relevant, and realistic. So when we're thinking about the restorative process, these are the questions I ask. So what did this impact have on you and others, right? What was the actual harm? The next question is, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? And this is a question that you have to ask as well as you're asking the student to make sure that it's a collaborative process. What can be done to repair the harm? What can you do to demonstrate that you can be a positive member of the community? What can be done to repair the trust? If we're thinking about that as a process and using that to come up with our consequence, then that's ensuring that it's restorative. These are just some examples. If it's an emotional could be disrespect, cursing out a teacher, cursing out another student, saying something inappropriate that leads to some emotional harm. What is the inappropriate consequence? An apology, not just verbal, but an apology in writing, obviously based upon their capacity level, that includes who it was done to, what was the impact, what is the solution? I'm writing this apology, and an agreement moving forward. What am I going to do moving forward to keep me from doing those same actions before, right? When it comes to material possessions or something physical, you would also include an apology, but then there may be some sort of restitution. How are they going to fix what went wrong? And it has to be done to the best of their ability. If a person can't afford, because of monetarily, or if they're not physically able to repair something, then we may have to come up with something that is equivalent, but within their capacity level. If it's communal, if it's something that's breaking the trust, like stealing from the group or something of that nature, you want to make sure maybe it's something like community service, something that actually serves the community. So when you're thinking about these consequences, we want to make sure that it's relevant to what they did. This could be done in terms of the emotional damage, material damage, as well as communal damage. These are some simple things that I look at. The you break it, you fix it model. Children take responsibility for fixing as best they can any problem or mess that they've created. If they spilled something, let them get it up to the best of it may not be perfect, but let them get it up to the best of their ability. The loss of privilege. In classrooms in which children help generate and construct the rules together, a sense of shared responsibility and trust exists. Students who do not take care of the rules, the logical consequences, they may lose privileges. But when they lose those privileges, you want to make sure that it's respectful, relevant, and realistic, right? Make sure that the time associated with losing that privilege makes sense. time out, or take a break. Sometimes the consequence is not that they're going to be doing something. The consequence may be a student who's on the verge of losing control and beginning to disrupt and disturb their own and others' ability to learn is asked to just take a break. The student may return when he or she or they have gained controls and is ready to participate in an appropriate way. Right? Once again, you want to make sure it's respectful, relevant, and realistic. We can do this together as a group. So, scenario 1. A student is given an in-school suspension for repeatedly arriving late to class. A student is given an in-school suspension for repeatedly arriving late to class. Is that a logical consequence? It's not? Okay, somebody talk to me why. Why is it not a logical consequence? Right here.
Coming late because they don't want to be in class to begin with, so you suspend them now, they don't have to be in class.
Okay, so they could be avoiding class and you're rewarding them. That's called secondary gain, right? They're getting a gain from missing class and you're rewarding them by helping them miss class again. What else?
They could have a family situation that's preventing them.
Okay.
A parent that needs help or.
Okay. So you're more so focused on the why it's happening. Okay, right here? They've already missed instruction time. So if the challenge is, what is the impact of missing instruction time? Right? So if we're talking to the students about the impact, that's where the consequence will come in, or that's where the intervention, we may not even have to call it a consequence. That's where the intervention would come into play, right? This was a very true story. There was a time when I had a student who consistently showed up late to class. Consistently. First period class. They were getting an A in the class. I met with the parent. I talked to the parent. They had a very unique circumstance that caused them to be late every day. What do you all think should have been done? Say it again? Nothing. I had a conversation with the parents, and we came up with an agreement, and we modified the time that they would arrive to school because they had a very unique circumstance. I didn't just implement a consequence strictly because the rule says they need to show up at a particular time. And because of that flexibility, they respected it. The students still got what they needed, right? The grades were still on point. We still had built a relationship with the parents, right? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Now, you know about this.
Okay.
I struggle with this because in the real world, if I tell my boss, oh, I can't come in to 10, they're not going to change my schedule. Maybe for one day, but as a...
People often talk about the real world. And in the real, right here, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so somebody may have to come in a little bit late because they're on FMLA, but nobody needs to know that information.
Correct.
You know, maybe there's meds or a blood draw or whatever, and they're 15 minutes late, and they adjust and make supports built in.
Correct. Yes, right here.
There's a lot of companies that have gone away from vacation days, sick days, and it's if you get your job done, you get your job done. You can take your days, your time when you need it. And obviously not schools.
Yeah.
In front of us. But I have a lot of friends that work under those philosophies now. And
Yes.
They get their job done because they want them to have the time that they want.
One thing I'll say is this. Often, the punitive route of dealing with students is often done from a space of love. It's often done from a space of love. It's, if I'm not harsh with this kid, then by the time they get out into the world, they're not going to make it. You ever heard that before? So I have to be tough, right? But the reality is, what we often do is we disconnect that student from education so early that now we're pushing them into a more harsh life because the real world is really adjusting to a lot of things now. I remember I was doing facilitating a training and at one of the colleges, and there was a consultant there, and she was upset, like, why aren't these students wearing suits? and she was saying that to the students, and the students knew that what she was saying wasn't accurate. They saw Google, they saw all these places. They know that there are adjustments that can be made based upon the specific circumstance. So when you appear rigid unnecessarily, you can often lose them, right? So it's important to be mindful of that when you're having those conversations with your young people, right? So in some instances, we wouldn't put any consequence in place. What will we put in place? What could we put in place for one? We're finding that the student's getting there late to school for real, right? We've talked to them. What can we put in place? What's a consequence?
We brought alarm clocks for kids that didn't have alarm clocks.
Okay. So alarm clocks. What else? That's support. What's the consequence, right?
I don't know if it's a high school, maybe their schedule shifted, maybe they don't have a first period class, maybe they start second period and they have a ninth period class.
Absolutely. So when I think about the harm, if I'm having the meeting in the first place, what is the harm would be they're suffering as a result of not getting that seat time, right? They're missing the opportunity to get that learning. So I would have to create an alternate way for them to get that learning. It may be after school, potentially, right? It may be during a time where another teacher could be there. We have to creatively figure out a way for that consequence to include them realizing why they need to be there on time, learning how to manage the time better, but also making up some of that time, right? So the consequence should include all those areas. Let's skip to number 3. 8th grade students had a food fight in the cafeteria in March. They will not be allowed to participate in graduation activities in June. Y'all like, no. Is that logical? No. Now, you all are saying that emphatically. I can't express to you the amount of times that I've been in a meeting, take their graduation away. You have never heard that before? I have, truly, right? So why is that not a logical consequence? What are some of the reasons? Talk to me. Okay, so it may not be relevant, right? It's not relevant right here. The time. What about the time?
From March to June,
From
to me, it's not an effective.
From March to June. Okay, what else?
Graduation is like a cumulative celebration of their entire educational career.
Yes.
And not just a one-time thing.
Yep.
So, like,
Powerful, right? In the back?
that's not every 8th grader.
It's not every 8th grader. Okay, I love that. What else? Right here.
That's the biggest thing, and I've taken away the biggest reward.
Uh-huh.
Motivation from March to June is gone.
No motivation. It can cause a downward spiral in their behavior. What else?
Well, I just think those two things don't necessarily connect, like the food fight and graduation.
They don't connect, right?
I don't know, make them clean it up. Or
So now we're thinking about, so what is the impact of the harm? What is the impact of the food fight? It's a mess, right? So how can we implement a consequence that stops the behavior and reconnects them back to the rules and the limits? And give them a teachable moment. What can we do? Say clean up? Okay. Is that enough? Clean up for how long? Apologize. Apologize to whom? Apologize to I like that. What else? What else can we implement?
Have them eat in the classroom instead of the cafeteria.
Okay, loss of privilege. So there's loss of privilege for a period of time. Yes, what else? This situation actually happened, and I consulted with the school, and I said this will be a great opportunity for them to work with the custodial staff for 2 weeks. Now they get to experience what is it like to clean someone else's mess, right? They're allowed to see what it feels like to serve others, right? So, and they get to see the dignity and learn the personality of the people that's actually been serving them and helping keep their lives simple, right? It creates an opportunity where now they're less likely to, those same students, from what I heard, now they would pick up their own mess a lot faster now because they can relate and empathize with someone who has to clean up after them, right? So as opposed to just simply suspending them, taking away graduation, now we implemented something that they're going to learn from, empathize, it repairs the harm, it serves the community, and that's how we make sure that a consequence is logical. Now, this is an activity that we have that much time for, but I would love for everyone to, this is an opportunity for you to do this when you go back to your home locations. You pull your QR codes up, and you can do this with your schools doing one of your PDs. when you pull this up, it pulls up the background information. This is an opportunity to practice a restorative conversation, where you practice that, what happened, why did it happen, what is the impact, creating an agreement. So if you can see when you pull it up, there's the background information. In this exercise, the person who's having the conversation, the only thing that they would have is the blurb or the one sentence that's on the screen. Through your restorative conversation, your goal would be to find out all the background information that would be supplied to the student who you're dealing with. So the way this would work is you'd partner up with someone, they would be the student, and they would get all the background information, and you would be the staff member. And this is the only information you'd have. And through having a restorative conversation, you'd figure out what happened, you figure out the why, you figure out the impact, and then you would come up with an agreement, an appropriate response for how you're dealing with this. It's a powerful concept. If you look at your worksheets, there's some other techniques and strategies. We talked about earlier the FAME mindset, F-A-M-E. Think like a free agent. A free agent understands that every opportunity is temporary. You're only going to be dealing with these individual students for the time that they're in your lives. A free agent understands that I need to have an impact on them while I have them, right? A free agent understands that you may not be working with your colleagues, the schools that you're working at forever. What are the skills that you need to learn? What are the skills that you can teach to them immediately while you're there? A, is train like an athlete. We talked about a lot of concepts. We talked about the meta model. We talked about transforming harmful statements into restorative statements. We walked through the process of how to have a restorative conversation. Right? I mean, quick question. If I gave you all the winning ticket to the lottery, would you put it in a safe or would you use it? You would use it. Often at professional developments, I can say I've been guilty of it myself. There are individuals who will they'll take their content, and as soon as they walk up out of here, they never look at it again. Repeat after me. Information without implementation leads to frustration. When the district brings a new initiative, when you get new content and you don't implement it, it ultimately just leads to frustration. Repeat after me. Information with implementation leads to transformation. I guarantee you, if you utilize the techniques that we talked about, the strategies that we learned today, I guarantee you, you can transform your lives, not just your learning community, but your families, the communities in which you engage with outside of school, because that's the power of a restorative community, even outside of the classroom. So let's commit to implementing what we learned here today. I think it's important that we realize that we are the leaders. And if we take this information back to our learning community, it can be transformative. We're going to end this by repeating after me. When everyone else is sitting, I will stand up. When everyone else is standing up, I will stand out. When everyone else is standing out, I will be outstanding. When everyone else is outstanding, I will become the standard. It's been my pleasure speaking with you all today. Thank you so much.